Number 3. In 1994, Columbia University's WKCR 89.9 radio station signal was hijacked, and a strange, demonic cheer-like sound and breathing replaces the music. A few minutes in, a voice starts reading lines of what appears to be obituaries, including the name of Robert Oppenheimer, who is considered to be the creator of the atomic bomb. This hijacked recording is referred to as the old tape. The original audio clip entered circulation on the internet via an anonymous 4chan user in March of 2013. In his post, he said, "Back in 1994 or 1995, when I recorded this off the radio, I told myself I'd never make a copy of the tape, having freaked myself out. But it's been sitting in the back of a desk drawer and the back of my mind for 16 years now, and now I'm just curious." The weird stuff starts at about 16 seconds in. Around 1995, I was about 15. I used to stay up late in my room listening to the radio on a boombox with an integrated tape recorder. I'd dial through the stations, and when I heard something interesting, I'd hit record for a while and then move on. One night I came across this. I don't think this was the beginning of the broadcast, but I caught a lot of it. Right at the end, an announcer says that the station I was tuned into was WKCR 89.9 New York. There are a bunch of names and dates in there, but I've never run into anything else like this. The following interruption is definitely creepy to say the least, and would no doubt be downright terrifying to someone driving home late at night listening to this station.
Jack Himmel, father of Michael.
In 1987, Henrietta Graham.
Mother Aya and Mother Sally.
March 17, 1988,
Mother Whittington.
You're tuned to WKCR FM New York, 89.9 on your dial. Colombian music is running a little late. It will be starting in a few minutes.
There are theories as to what this actually was. For example, some believe the listener accidentally tuned into a number station. However, others contradict this theory by stating they also witnessed the hijacking 13 years ago. Either way, 13 years later, the source for this hijacking remains unidentified. Number 2. On November 18th, 1978, the Jonestown Massacre took more than 900 members of an American cult known as the People's Temple. Well, more specifically, those 900 and something members took their own lives in this mass suicide murder under the direction of their leader, Jim Jones. Jones was a preacher who founded a racially integrated church in Redwood Valley, California. He wanted to make a communist community, so he bought some land in Guyana and moved with his followers to his new settlement, where he founded Jonestown. In Jonestown, living conditions were hellish, and because of the use of armed guards, people were not allowed to leave or were just too scared to attempt to. What's not too well known about this massacre is that a lot of people who took part in the mass suicide were not completely willing to go through with it. Jones was a very controlling leader and later proved to be very dangerous as well. After many years of moving settlements and because of the negative media attention he was gaining, Jones moved with all of his followers to the Guyanese jungle, where he promised nothing but a utopian community in his newly founded town. It was proven just how dangerous and crazy Jones really was on November 18, 1978, when a US representative named Leo Ryan went to Jonestown to investigate claims of abuse in Jones' settlement when he and 4 of his representatives were shot dead by Jonestown gunmen. That same day, Jones ordered his followers to ingest poison-laced punch while armed guards stood by. In other words, Jones, out of fear from US retaliation, scared his followers into thinking that suicide was the only option. Those who refused were encouraged and even threatened by armed guards. There is no video footage of the event that's viewable online, but the audio recording of the event is captured in full. It's about an hour long, and at the start of it you can hear Jones trying to ease his speech into pitching the idea of a mass suicide to his captive followers. In the background throughout the recording you can hear applauding mixed with crying from both adults and children, dogs barking, and the slow and eventual fading out of all background noises as people fall dead one by one as Jones finishes up his speech. Every child and even every pet was forced to ingest the poison. Even listening to bits and pieces of the recording can be sickening, especially after knowing the real evilness behind the whole story.
How very much I've loved you. How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. The world, the kingdom suffereth violence, and the violence shall take it by force. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We've been so betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed.
Not that I'm afraid to die.
I don't
By
think
no
you are.
means.
I don't think you are.
But I look at our babies and I think they deserve to live.
I agree.
You know?
But also they deserve, what's more, they deserve peace.
We all came here for peace.
And have we had it?
No.
I've tried to give it to you. I've laid down my life practically. I've practically died every day to give you peace. And you've still not had any peace. You look better than I've seen you in a long while, but it's still not the kind of peace that I wanted to give you. So, a person's a fool that continues to say that you're a winner when you're losing. I'm not letting them take your jar. Can you let them take your jar?
See John die?
What's that?
You mean you want to see John, the little one, the king?
I want to see... Peace.
At one time, I felt just like Christine felt. But after today, I don't feel anything because the biggest majority of the people that left here were white. And I know it really hurt my heart because
Broke your heart, didn't it?
It broke my heart to think that all of these years that these white people have been with us and they're not a part of us. So we might as well end it now because I don't see...
Talking, the congressman has been murdered.
Please get us some medication. It's simple, there's no convulsions with it, it's just simple, just please get it. Before it's too late, the GDF will be here. I tell you, get moving. Yeah.
Aren't crying from pain. It's just a little bitter tasting, but they're not crying out of any pain.
We've set an example for others. We've set 1,000 people who say we don't like the way the world is. Stop. Take our life from us. We laid it down. We got tired. We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide protesting the conditions of an inhumane world.
And number 1, the Grizzly Man recording. Timothy Treadwell, also known as the Grizzly Man, was an American bear enthusiast and founder of an organization called Grizzly People, which is a bear protection group. Timothy, as well as his girlfriend Amy Huguenard, hated seeing bears in captivity and loved seeing and being with them in their natural habitats. In fact, their love and fascination with bears was so great that he and she both dedicated 13 straight years during the summer months to visiting Katmai National Park to actually live alongside the grizzly bears. Timothy in his late years started gaining a bit of fame, as well as some infamy. Many people criticized the couple's practices and their lack of safety measures taken. Many argued that the bears should be left alone and are not an animal that humans should try to bond with. Others were more concerned with their lack of safety measures taken when in the presence of bears, for example, lacking any weapons that could be used in a self-defense scenario.
If I show weakness, if I retreat, I may be hurt, I may be killed. I must hold my own if I'm going to stay within this land. For once there is weakness, they will exploit it, they will take me out, they will decapitate me, they will chop me into bits and pieces. I'm dead. But so far, I persevere.
Now, the couple usually stayed with the bears until late September, but in 2003, Treadwell and his girlfriend decided to stay in the park for an extra week into October in order to locate a bear that they had not seen the whole summer. This was a very bad idea, as grizzly bears tend to become more aggressive in the fall months as they begin to fatten up for hibernation. They were even warned by friends not to stay longer than they had originally planned, but they ignored this logical advice, which later proved to be a fatal mistake. During the first few days of this extension, Timothy spoke with friends, saying the bears were acting fine. However, the day a plane was sent to pick up the couple, it was discovered that Timothy and Amy had been mauled with about half of their bodies eaten by the grizzly bears. Rangers found and shot dead a grizzly guarding the camp when they arrived. After killing this bear, a smaller bear charged at them, and they killed it as well. Moments before the mauling, Timothy's girlfriend turned on a video camera which captured the complete audio of the attack. No video was captured though. The screen on the original clip was completely black, as the camera was either in a bag or had its lens cap on. However, the audio alone is enough to give anybody chills. Throughout most of the recording, you can hear Treadwell's screams of agony as he is mauled by the bear which he named the Grinch. Closer to the end, Treadwell is heard being dragged away by the bear, and Amy's screams turn from reactive to screams of pain and agony as well, as one of the bears catches her as she endures the same gruesome death as her now dead boyfriend. If you're interested in learning more about Timothy Treadwell's story, there is a documentary called Grizzly Man that goes into detail about the whole tragedy. It was senior year. I had just recently started dating my fiancée Mark. We were approaching the end of the school year, and so prom was coming up. I didn't really know if I wanted to go because I had just finally changed all of my contact info and my family moved to a new house because of my old stalker ex Daryl, who's 4 years older than me. I was 18 and he was 22. We met when I was going through a rough time in my life. Long story, but he turned out to be a psychotic asshole. He got kicked out of the army and started doing hard drugs like heroin. I distanced myself from him as much as I could, but he was relentless. He attempted to break into my family's home at least 3 times, and I had to get a restraining order against him. But my family was worried for me, and for all of us, so we had to move to another house. The reason I was hesitant about going to prom was because I knew my ex Daryl knew about it. We used to talk about going to my prom together. Ever since our move, my friends would drive me home and make sure we weren't followed. I really lived in fear. I was scared Daryl would show up to the prom venue and try to find me. Mark has always been very understanding and supportive, and he assured me he wouldn't tell me to go to prom if he didn't think it would be safe. He made me feel comfortable with it. We and our friends went in a limousine together to the venue, which was a fancy catering hall about 30 minutes away. We all sat at our table and had food and just hung out for a while. Some people went to dance, Mark and I included, for a while. I couldn't help but be paranoid for a while that Daryl was in the building somehow. One of Mark's friends handed me a little shot bottle of vodka and told me it would calm my nerves. I drank it in the bathroom and almost threw up, but within half an hour it really did take the edge off. A few hours later, our group wanted to leave for what's called the after prom, where you basically start drinking and continuing the party elsewhere with your friends. As we walked outside of the venue to our respective rides, I saw one car parked in front of the venue that didn't have its lights on. I didn't know what Daryl drove at that point, or if he drove, but I saw someone sitting in it. They had a baseball hat on and were looking down, so I couldn't see their face. I pointed it out to Mark. He told me to relax, there's no way it's him. We got in our friend's car who was picking us up, and we drove to our friend Melissa's house, who was having a little after party. The whole ride, I kept looking behind us, seeing if we were being followed, but I couldn't tell because there were so many cars on the road. I remember Mark whispering to me, "Relax, everything's fine," and he held my hand, and it helped calm me down so much. We arrived to Melissa's house, and there were already people at her house. At the peak of the night, I'd say there were 20 people there, and everyone was drinking. Eventually, Mark and I wanted to go home, so Mark called his sister to come pick us up, and when she got there, we went straight out to her car. I looked around the street for any sketchy-looking cars, but didn't see anything, and at this point, I officially convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Mark's sister drove us back to their house where I would be sleeping over. It was just his mom and his sister home. His dad is a retired cop, but he was still working at the time, and he was working a late shift that night. His mom was already asleep. It was very late. Mark and I just went downstairs to his room to crawl into bed. The whole den floor of the house was his floor. It had a mini kitchen, bedroom, and living room. His floor was level with the backyard, and so it had a back door. It was a warm night, so some of the windows were cracked open. We were watching a funny movie. That was when we heard a bang on the glass door that led to the backyard. The sliding curtain was covering the door, so we couldn't see who or what did it. I shrieked, and Mark jumped up to open the curtain. No one was on the other side, but there was a post-it note slapped on the door with the word "bitch" on it. He found me. He followed me from the prom to Melissa's house to here, and he probably heard me laughing and knew I was down here. My paranoia was right all along. We went upstairs to Mark's mom's room and woke her up, then called Mark's dad and the police. Waiting for Mark's dad and the rest of the police to arrive felt like an actual eternity. When the doorbell finally rang, followed by loud knocks, Mark and his mom went to go answer the door. It was the police. I had to explain the whole story with my ex, and the restraining order, and now being followed by him here. They asked if there were any cameras on the property, to which Mark's mom said no. Then they asked me if I had any texts from him, or if perhaps I knew where he lived. I told them I didn't have his number anymore, and I had no idea where he lived anymore either. Mark's dad finally arrived on the scene. I took the post-it note from the door home with me to try and compare it to other handwriting from Daryl, and it definitely matched. Mark's dad gave me a ride to my house in his police car so that we could be sure I wouldn't be followed. During the ride home, I called our home phone and my dad picked up. I cried to him into the phone hysterically. After arriving home, my parents were waiting in the front for me. Mark's dad assured my parents we weren't followed. During this period, Mark and I couldn't go to each other's houses. Mark's parents had security cameras installed the same week, and this next part is truly unbelievable. One of the side cameras on their property picked up motion, which alerted Mark's dad's phone. He grabbed his gun and ran outside to the smell of gasoline. He followed the smell until he heard the sound of liquid being poured out of a can, and there he saw Daryl pouring out gasoline on the sides of their house. With his gun drawn, Mark's dad yelled at him to drop the can and put his hands up, and that was the moment Daryl was no longer going to be a threat to my or my loved ones' lives. I call it the sweetest justice that my future fiance's cop dad was the one to arrest my psychotic ex-boyfriend who ruined so many years of my life and had me living in worry. He was sentenced to over 30 years for his crimes, the worst of which of course was attempted arson on a police officer's house. It was 2017. I was 17 getting ready for prom. And of course, girls have it harder because instead of the guys who just rent the same tuxedos, girls have to find a nice dress that they're going to keep. And of course, prom dresses aren't cheap, if you want a nice one at least. My parents didn't want to spend over $200 for a prom dress, so my mom suggested I look online for a used one. She'd even help me. We scrolled on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, which had just become a thing back then and wasn't as popular as it is today. There wasn't really any luck on Facebook Marketplace, so we mainly searched Craigslist. We found a listing for a dress that we both liked. It was a navy blue evening gown, $50. It said it was worn once for prom. The seller lived pretty close too, so I contacted the number listed on the listing, and in under 10 minutes I got a text back. After expressing my interest and asking a couple sizing questions, the person offered to come to our house to drop it off to us. But my mom said no to having someone from Craigslist come to our house, so I said we'd come to them that day. I asked for their name and they said Alex. Honestly, I assumed that Alex was short for Alexandra. My mom offered to come with me. I felt more comfortable if she'd drive me. When we got to the address, it was a townhouse in a congested area of town. The townhouse was on a dead end. My mom asked if I wanted her to come in with me, and honestly, I don't know why, but I thought it would be embarrassing to go in with my mom. I asked her to just wait in the car unless I text her. I texted Alex, and then I went to ring the doorbell. I noticed all the blinds on the windows were closed, which was strange. It was the middle of the day. The door opened, and instead of some young girl around my age opening the door, it was an actual grown man, like 50 years old. He smiled and asked if I was here for the dress. I said, "Yeah, are you Alex?" And he said, "Yeah." He said I looked just like his daughter, and then said, "Come inside." I looked back at my mom's car and then went inside the house. He said I should be a perfect fit for the dress. He said he'd go get it, then disappeared into another room. The living room was dark and kind of messy. I took out my phone and texted my mom to come to the front door. Then the man called out from a room for me to come inside and try the dress on in front of a mirror. I asked him if he could bring the dress out to the living room. He said there's no mirror in the living room, and I replied that I'd just like to see the dress first. He left the room and entered the living room empty-handed, and said the dress is on the bed in the bedroom if I want to go look at it. I once again asked him to please just bring it out here. Then a knock at the front door. Alex said, "Who is that?" And I opened the door to my mom stepping inside. She smiled and said hello to the man, and he took a couple seconds to say hello back, but without a smile. Now I walked to the doorway of the bedroom, and as I did, he made a noise as if to say, "Don't go in there." I looked into the dark bedroom, and there was no dress on the bed. My mom was in the middle of asking a question when I interrupted and said, "There's no dress." There was a painfully uncomfortable and tense silence, and then the man said, "I'd like you to leave now." My mom and I, without hesitation, left to the car. By the time we were in the car, the front door was already closed, and I saw the man peering through the kinked blinds. We were both in shock. If my mom hadn't come in, I don't know what would have happened. I reported the Craigslist ad. We didn't call the police though, because there was really no proof of anything, and technically nothing happened. But there was no blue dress in that room. He was just trying to get me into that room, and when my mom came in, he couldn't exactly do that anymore. Thank God I listened to my mom and didn't give him our address. I ended up getting a used dress shipped to me. That prom night, I told everyone this story. and it's still kind of haunting even today. In our high school class, there was a kid named Joshua that moved to our high school during freshman year, so I guess he had a hard time breaking into any of the established friend groups. He had a few friends here and there from what I know, but he wasn't part of any particular groups. But then something really awkward happened one day during lunch. I had already asked my date Natalie to prom, and she said yes. At lunch, we had a table of mixed guys and girls, and Natalie was at the table. Here came Joshua from whatever table he was sitting at, and like an awkward scene out of a movie, he tapped Natalie on the shoulder and asked her to prom. The whole table went silent except for one kid who cheered sarcastically. Then Natalie laughed in clear discomfort and said she's already going with me. I felt the secondhand embarrassment. Joshua looked at me, and I didn't know what to think of the stare he gave me, but I could tell he was humiliated. He left without saying a word, and everyone laughed loudly. It was a horribly uncomfortable scenario all around. While I felt bad, I couldn't help but slightly laugh too. I mean, I have no idea what he thought was going to happen, especially with such a large audience of dudes at the table too. We watched as Joshua actually left the cafeteria, and the teacher on lunch duty actually chased after him because you weren't allowed to leave without a pass. But Joshua never came back into the lunchroom. I still wonder where he went from there. On prom night, we had our group of 10 in the back of the limo. The same 10 of us sat at the table together when at the dance. Everything was going as prom should. But then, eventually that night, one of my friends told me, "Don't look now, but Joshua's at that table eyeballing you." I waited like 10 seconds before looking over, and I saw Joshua shooting a dagger at, I guess, Natalie and I. I decided I'd go talk to him, but as I walked over to him, he got up and hurried away out of the dance hall. That was super weird, but I wasn't going to chase after him. I went over to the table he was sitting at and asked a couple of the kids if they came with Joshua, and they said no, he kinda just sat there randomly and wasn't saying anything. I went back to my table, and like a typical high schooler, I told the whole table. It was definitely pretty freakish. After prom, Natalie and I left with a friend who drove to go to a diner to eat a bunch of breakfast food at like 12 a.m. After that, we went to our friend Anthony's house. He had a massive backyard right next to a nature preserve, and he had a really cool fire pit. So we all circled the fire pit with a speaker playing music and some drinks. There were 6 of us total. Anthony, sitting across from me, pointed out to the woods and said he saw something in the woods. We all looked over, of course. We looked at the woods for a while, but when we didn't see anything, Anthony basically said, "Aight, whatever." We continued to hang by the fire pit for a while. Eventually one couple left, so it was just Natalie, Anthony, his date, and myself left. Anthony was mid-sentence when he stopped speaking abruptly. I said, "What?" and I turned around and saw someone walking towards the light of the fire from the woods. It was someone in a tuxedo. He said to us, "Don't get up." As he got closer, we realized it was Joshua. He was holding a hatchet or small axe. He looked like he had been crying, but he also looked angry. Anthony and I told him to please put the axe down and just talk. Joshua yelled at us to shut up, and he made us turn the music off. He began a rant about how soul-crushingly embarrassing what happened during lunch that day was, and how he had been too embarrassed to come back to school after that because he thought it had been spread all over the school, but it really hadn't, and we tried to tell him that. Anytime we tried to speak, he'd scream "shut the fuck up" louder and louder, and he'd begin to raise the axe, kind of. He then directed his attention to Natalie and started going on about how he thought she was gorgeous and that she would only make fun of him with her friends, which again, that never happened. All these things only happened in his head. During this time that he was talking to Natalie, Anthony was low-key and texted his dad something like "bring the gun to the backyard," making it clear we were in danger. Anthony's dad came out to the back door and yelled, "What's going on?" with his gun in his hand. Joshua stopped talking, and I could see he was deciding in his head whether to run or not. He dropped the axe and ran back to the woods. Anthony's dad came running over with his gun, and we all 4 of us couldn't tell him what happened quick enough. His dad said not to touch the axe, leave the fingerprints on it for the police. That hatchet, axe, whatever, was eventually the key to prosecuting Joshua after a few days. Joshua had already been arrested, and so his fingerprints were in the system, and they matched the fingerprints on the axe. But when all four of us decided we didn't want to press charges on Joshua, it was too late. By that point, he got charged criminally. Anthony's friend said it was for menacing in the 2nd degree. He didn't serve any jail time. I found Joshua on Facebook shortly after this and reached out to him with a sincere message, not attacking him at all, and he read it. He never replied to it. I saw Joshua one other time in the halls that year. He didn't look at me. None of us ever saw him again after graduation. My college years were some of the best years of my life. Don't get me wrong, I'm very happy with the life I live, but my memories of those 4 years are eternal. My advice to anyone still in college, don't take it for granted, because it definitely flies by. I went to a beach college. Our campus was literally right on the water. This story takes place while I was undergoing pledge with my pledge class. If you don't know, that's basically a full semester of initiation for everyone who got bids to the frat that semester. Most of what happens during pledge is better left undiscussed. Anyway, it was the last week of pledge before we officially became brothers. Typically, this is the week where the fraternity kicks things up a notch, so to speak. For us, it was commonly understood that at some point during the final week, we'd have to undergo the beach challenge. Here's what would happen. The brothers would drive our entire class about 12 miles down the coast on Friday night. Then we'd have an hour to finish a massive keg filled with God knows what. Then they'd walk us down to the beach, tie all of our wrists together, blindfold us, take our phones, watches, and shoes, and leave us there. We'd have until sunrise to make it back to the house. Otherwise, we'd all be dropped. To be completely honest with you, I was pretty nervous leading up to this, but there was really nothing I could do. There was nothing any of us could do. I remember it being oddly chilly the night of, but the excitement of becoming a brother and finally being done with all this nonsense was adrenalizing. The kegs were the easy part. By this point, we were pretty comfortable with divvying up the alcohol and pulling trig if necessary. There were 15 of us. After tying us together, the brothers blindfolded everyone but Chandler, who was at the very front of the line. He was to be our eyes, but that's all the help we'd get. Our pledge master was this big Mexican guy named Ramirez, but he insisted we all call him Los Pollos, like the restaurant from Breaking Bad. He was a strange dude. He outlined the rules for us one last time, then joined the rest of the brothers and left. We were now on our own. I won't run you through everyone's names, but my closest friends in my pledge class were Chandler, Whitworth, Jackson, and Vikram. I was at the very back of the line, and Whitworth was directly in front of me. We began walking with Chandler leading us. It was hell. Without our phones, there really was no way of telling how much ground we were covering or how much time we had left. All we could do was keep walking. At first, we tried to liven the mood by talking and cracking jokes, but eventually that got old. After what I'll call 2 hours of walking, we were trudging along in complete silence, with the occasional stop for someone to throw up. I started to disassociate. Even the sounds of the ocean grew silent as I walked along, trapped inside my own head. It was completely silent. Suddenly, I felt a sharp tug on the rope around my wrists, so I took a few big steps forward and stopped, assuming Whitworth had fallen. Whitworth was a little more clumsy than most, so this kind of thing wasn't super surprising. I didn't really have the strength nor energy to ask him if he was alright, so I just waited. I must have been standing there like a statue for a full minute. Something felt off. I was just about to say something, when the rope around my wrists was pulled tight again. I resumed walking, pleased that Whitworth hadn't passed out. The trek resumed, and I drifted back into my zoned out phase, feeling terrible. I prayed we were closing in on the final stretch. We had to be. Just then, I took what must have been my 10,000th step, but something was different. Instead of hitting damp sand, my foot slapped the unmistakable thin layer of ocean water. I took a few more steps and the water got deeper, reaching up to my ankles. I was confused. Why would Chandler be leading us into the water? The rope pulled tight again, meaning Whitworth and everyone else in front of me was continuing to walk, so I did the same.
I guess I figured someone needed to wash off their feet for whatever reason. If no one else was complaining though, I definitely wasn't going to start. The water remained ankle height for a while, advancing and receding with the sway of the waves. Just then though, I felt the water begin to rise again, until it was comfortably around my shins. Chandler was definitely screwing with us, which for the life of me I couldn't understand why. Wasn't this stupid activity painful enough? The water was only going to slow us down. Seconds later, it began to pick up on a faint sound in the distance. I craned my ears and began to recognize it. It was the sound of an idling boat engine. As we continued to walk, the drone of the engine only got louder, meaning it was getting closer, or I was getting closer to it. I was starting to get really uncomfortable. The water was almost up to my knees at this point. Finally, I broke what must have been hours of unspoken silence. Guys, what the hell are we doing in the water? I waited, confused as to why no one was answering me. Guys, I asked again in a more concerned voice. Still nothing. I could feel panic begin to set in. Suddenly, my blindness was suffocating. I had to look around. I reached my wrists up towards my eyes in an attempt to undo my blindfold. As I did so, the rope yanked away from me, forcing my arms back down. I cursed, plunging my head down towards my fingers and undoing my blindfold before the rope could be jolted away from me again. To my horror, Whitworth wasn't the one guiding me. Instead, I found myself staring at a random, middle-aged man holding the frayed end of the rope tied around my wrists. I stared in shock at the severed rope in his hand, and that's when I realized what had done the cutting. A long, rusty kitchen knife sat in his left hand. Past him, there was a boat bobbing in the water, and I could make out 3 more silhouettes towering on board. I screamed bloody murder before he had a chance to react, yanking my arms upward as fiercely as I could. At the same time, I lifted a foot out of the water and kicked his chest with all the strength I could muster. Luckily, the rope broke free from his grip. He grabbed my shirt to try and cushion his fall, but the fabric gave way with a deafening rip. He yelled as he plunged into the water with a huge chunk of my white pledge t-shirt, but I was already moving as fast as I could toward dry land, my wrists still tied. A few seconds passed before I heard a splash from further away. Someone had jumped off the boat. I didn't even look behind me, I just kept moving. I was about halfway to the sand when something whizzed right past my head, maybe a few inches from my right ear. It was the knife. I watched it shoot past me before disappearing into the water. I was in complete shock, but the adrenaline was doing its job. I got to land and for the first time looked back. There were 2 men in the water and 2 on the boat. They weren't chasing me anymore, just staring lifelessly in my direction. The closest man was still holding onto the white piece of my shirt that had torn off in the fray. I didn't waste another second. I ran up the beach and made it to the street. By this point, it was past sunrise, but my frat was the last thing I was thinking about. I flagged down the nearest car, and after pleading to use their phone, called the police. It was no use. By the time the cops showed up, the 4 men were gone, presumably off to wherever in that tiny little boat of theirs. I lied to the cops about what happened, worried that there might be repercussions for the frat. Luckily, they didn't ask questions. I didn't get too much crap from my frat brothers. They were actually more pissed at Chandler for not realizing what had happened, even though he swears he didn't hear a thing. After that, I became a brother, and things went back to normal. Well, normal for a while. A few weeks later, a couple of the guys and I were playing beach die in the sand behind the house when Jackson noticed something in the distance. There was a stick poking out of the sand, and tied to that stick was the white piece of cloth that had been torn from my t-shirt. The design on the ripped stick was unmistakable. It was my shirt. To this day, I have no idea how they knew which frat I was in. My brothers think they might have recognized the piece of my t-shirt, but I have a more sinister theory. I think it's very possible that they knew our frat would be sending us pledges on that beach that night, helpless and blind. I think they very well could have planned the whole thing around that stupid tradition, swooping in and kidnapping whoever they could. I was just unlucky enough to be in the back, which still gives me chills to this day. I still wonder what might have happened to me had I gotten on that boat. The police, as always, were useless. It's been nearly a number of years, and they never found anything. This happened to me about a year ago today. which is why I'm writing about it now. I'm a 19-year-old college student that was in the middle of joining a fraternity on my campus. I go to a big party school down south, and Greek life is taken very seriously there. For privacy reasons, I'll spare the specific details, but this particular night was my initiation, meaning the night that me and my class of 20 students would officially become brothers of the fraternity. During the process of joining, which lasts a couple of months, the brothers would make us do odd things, like blindfold us and take us to strange places. You know, typical hazing stuff. This was one of those nights. We were blindfolded and left the frat house around 10:30 p.m. The brothers took our phones and drove us to a mystery location, split between a couple different cars to make sure we all got there. On the way over, they made us try and memorize some corny song while it blasted on full volume. We always had to do these annoying tasks while blindfolded, I guess as part of the whole hazing thing. Anyway, after about 20 minutes of driving, the car stopped and I heard the doors open and close. I felt a hand grab my arm and silently usher me out of the car. We walked probably 200 feet, where I was then told to sit down and be quiet. I was sitting on grass, so I assumed we were in a field or something. I could also tell I was sitting near people because I heard them sit down, and I also heard the brothers telling each of them to be quiet. After about a minute of sitting in silence, I heard a voice speak to all of us, saying a bunch of fraternity-related things, but mostly about how we were deemed worthy of becoming a part of the Brotherhood. Then, over the course of like 30 minutes, I sat in silence, occasionally hearing the sound of footsteps and movement around me. I figured they might have been doing the final steps of initiation with each person individually, like walking them away to talk to them in private. I didn't know for sure, but being blindfolded meant I was just left to my imagination. There was a time, though, when the footsteps went away, and all I was left with were the sounds of crickets and leaves rustling through the night breeze. I began to grow uncomfortable, as it must have been like 20 minutes that I was sitting there in silence. Then suddenly, I finally heard the footsteps of one of the brothers walk up to me, and I felt a hand grab my wrist and lead me away. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. I just wanted to get it over with so I could take the stupid blindfold off. While we walked, I could feel the ground below me go from grass to more rough terrain. I could tell we were walking through a forest, as I felt branches and shrubs scrape against my body. We were walking for some time, and at one point, the blindfold became very uncomfortable around my eyes. I told him this and asked if we could stop for a second so I could adjust it. He stopped and let go of me. As I stood there rubbing my eyes from under the blindfold, I heard a deep, raspy voice say, "Take it off." I hesitated for a second, not knowing what to say. His voice threw me off as it didn't sound like a voice I recognized. Needless to say, I took it off. And what I was greeted with was not what I imagined. I was standing face to face with some tall guy dressed in all black, wearing a vendetta mask. I let out a sharp yell and jumped back. A part of me thought this was just some fucked up hazing prank, but before a word could even escape my mouth, he lunged at me, yelling that he was going to take me with him. We wrestled on the ground, and I could tell that he was trying to choke me out. With all my strength, I threw him off of me, got up, and bolted in the opposite direction, using nothing but moonlight to guide my way back. My heart was beating 1,000,000 times a minute, and I kept looking back, fearing that he was following me. I eventually heard people yelling my name, and I nearly ran head-on into one of the fraternity brothers. I told him in scrambled, broken words that some random guy wearing a mask led me into the forest and tried fighting me, but before I could warn them any further, 5 or 6 of them rushed past me with flashlights looking to chase after him. One of them stayed with me to calm me down and walk me back to safety. When we made it out of the woods, I realized we were in a backyard, presumably one of the brothers' houses. I saw nearly the whole fraternity standing out on the porch, looking at us in shock. I asked them what the hell was going on. They said that since it was dark and that I was the last in line, the brother who was supposed to be escorting me somehow overlooked that I was there and completely forgot about me. They said a couple minutes later, one of them thought they saw movement in the woods, which was around the same time that they realized I wasn't in my group. I was in such shock I couldn't even be pissed about it. None of them knew who that man was, but some of the brothers speculated it could have been a brother from another fraternity. Shortly after, flashlights emerged from the trees, and I saw them running back towards us. They told everyone to get the fuck out of there and get back to the campus immediately. He didn't ask questions. They locked up the house, and one of them got on the phone with the police. The whole car ride back, I was bombarded with questions, and I answered them the best I could with my mind still racing. I wondered where that man came from, why was he wearing a mask, and what he could have been leading me to. I made up scenarios in my head, like how it could have been a brother from a rival fraternity trying to steal me before I was initiated. That doesn't explain why the brothers locked up the house and called the police, though. I didn't find out until the next day, when one of the brothers who ran after him told me what they found in those woods, and what they found was not what I expected. As they were running, they saw a light in the distance. They grew silent, and when they got closer, they realized it was a bonfire in the middle of a clearing. Standing around the fire were several people dressed in all black and wearing white vendetta masks, chanting and throwing things into the fire. One of the brothers stepped on a loud branch, causing all of the masked men to turn and face them. They froze up, and like something straight out of a horror movie, the mysterious men suddenly started running in their direction. They fled and made it back, where they told everyone else to leave and call the police. It seemed as though we somehow walked ourselves into some cult ritual meeting of some sort. I couldn't sleep for many nights after, and I tried my best to rid my mind of the situation. However, something that I heard from the fraternity a few days later sent shivers down my spine. While a few of them were playing football in the backyard of that same house, they found a white vendetta mask hanging from a tree nearby. They called the police, and the cops took it for evidence and examination. I'm not sure if those guys were ever caught or if the police even made anything of it. I'm also not sure what the hell those weird people were doing in those woods. I've been thinking about this experience a lot recently, and I'm glad that I was left with nothing more than a crazy story. It's been 8 years since I graduated from college. I went to Cooper Union, a small technical school smack dab in the middle of Manhattan. Going to school in New York City was amazing, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. We didn't have many frats back then, so I was sure to join whichever one I could just to ensure that I'd have parties to go to and whatnot. I was a relatively normal kid, so it wasn't too difficult to get a bid. Most of the pledge events were pretty tame, but I would soon find out what they were compensating for. I hope I don't get in trouble for divulging this story, but it happened so long ago that I figure it's safe to talk about. I doubt my old frat is still making their pledges even do this. I certainly hope they aren't. Anyway, the big thing that we do during our initiation was a subway crawl. I can't remember where exactly this was, but there was an old abandoned subway station that teenagers would typically explore. Our frat would make us enter from one of the active platforms, walk to the abandoned one, take some pictures, and then continue to the next active platform. We'd been given subway schedules to ensure that there was no chance a train would come around while we were vulnerable. We'd have plenty of time to get onto the abandoned platform, wait for one train to pass, and then make it to the next station. I know what you're probably thinking, but no, we didn't have to run from a train. The route was planned pretty well, and we all had a lot of leeway when it came to traversing the track. All we had to do was avoid the dangerous third rail and we'd be okay. I had been a big fan of urban exploring before college, so this was honestly more exciting than nerve-wracking for me. It was some random weekday at like 3 a.m. when our frat brothers made us go down into the subway. I'm pretty sure they picked this time because trains were very infrequent and we'd be protected at all costs. There were about 10 of us. I'm telling you, it was a pretty small school. You don't need to know everyone's name, but I should mention that my closest friend in my pledge class was an Albanian dude named Riker. He's the funniest guy you'll ever meet. My friends and I always said he should try and do stand-up comedy. He also smoked a crap ton of pot, which is important for this story. The group of us made our way into the subway unscathed. Riker and I brought up the rear because everyone else was too scared to do so. It was really dark in there, and our frat brothers had only given us 2 flashlights to share. Those flashlights and a single cheap film camera were all we had. At first, I was entrusted with one of the flashlights for being in the back, but I quickly gave it up to one of my pledge brothers who was whining about not being able to see. Not even 30 seconds into the walk, and Riker had his first genius idea. He pulled out a pre-rolled joint from his jacket and grinned, motioning for me to stop. "I don't have enough to share," he whispered, flicking his head in the direction of the other guys who hadn't noticed what we were doing. Against my better judgment, I obliged. Heck, when was I going to get the chance to light up in a subway tunnel again? The 2 of us smoked while we watched the other guys travel further away from us, their echoing laughter beginning to fade out. We finished the pot. We were a considerable distance behind the pack. Riker's stuff was really strong, and I found myself a little more absent-minded than I wanted to be. My tolerance was definitely not as high as his. The two of us picked up the pace to catch up with the rest of the group, but Riker noticed something in our way. We didn't have a light, so all we could see was the silhouette of someone in the dimly lit tunnel lights. I strained my eyes a little more. There was definitely a person in there, just standing motionless in the middle of the track, facing us. It was honestly a little creepy. "David?" called Riker, his voice piercing the silence of the tunnel. The person on the track didn't respond. Just then, David's voice called back to us from further up the line. The two of us froze. This person in front of us was a stranger. As if David's voice was some kind of switch, the person on the track started full-on sprinting towards us. The two of us turned around and bolted back the way we came. Being as high as I was, I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. The figure's sprint was eerily silent, as if we were being chased by a shadow. The sky must have been impossibly light. Riker's grip on my arm tightened, his goofy confidence completely gone. "Faster," he hissed, the fear in his voice mimicking my own. I knew we still had some time before the next train came, but running in the wrong direction just felt wrong. Riker must have thought the same thing, because he frantically pulled me to the side, motioning for us to cross the divider onto a different track. In hindsight, we probably could have continued running back to the original station, but I was so high that I just followed Riker blindly. We made it across the divider and sprinted back in the direction of the abandoned station. Things were even more terrifying now, though. We had literally no idea when a train was going to barrel down towards us on this track, but at least we were heading in the right direction. I hoped Riker's maneuver was enough to shake whoever was chasing us, but apparently it wasn't. Whoever was behind us also crossed the divider and kept running after us. The problem was there were only a few places where the divider could be crossed, so we'd have to pray we found another one before a train came. Turning around to the one we just used was no longer an option. My heart was thumping, but Riker and I were able to widen the gap between us and our pursuer. We kept running though, looking for a place to cross, but with no luck. Riker started cursing repeatedly, and I started feeling like throwing up. We kept running, still searching for a place to cross. Just then, the track started vibrating, and we could see light beginning to poke through at the distant end of the tunnel. A train was coming. We were screwed. I considered turning around and just fighting whoever was behind us, but then Riker screamed right here, running toward the divider. By some miracle, the next crossing point was right in front of us, and the two of us crossed back to the original track. We sprinted like another 30 yards and caught up with the rest of the guys who were on the platform. Riker explained the whole thing while I leaned over and threw up. Not even 30 seconds later, the train on the other track zoomed by. Riker and the rest of the guys were ready to confront whoever was chasing us. No one showed up though. We thought the worst, but just then, we heard another crazed yell from somewhere in the distance. To this day, I still have no idea how that person avoided the train. We waited for the train to pass on our track and then sprinted the hell out of there. In hindsight, Riker and I probably just encountered some homeless guy who was drugged out and might not have even posed a threat to us. The fear took over in that moment though, which I guess explains the stupid decision we made to cross over the divider. I'm sure the two of us also could have fended that guy off, but I'm glad we didn't have to. When my dad passed away, not only did he pass along his fishing boat, but he also passed along his love of fishing to me. The boat is a Rodman 1250, which has a decent-sized cabin, allowing me to go overnight deep-sea fishing. I usually fish off the coast of Mississippi, and would sail for an hour out to sea, then stop and spend the rest of the day fishing. That's exactly what I did one Friday, taking my cousin Jack. I planned on spending the night and fishing most of Friday, then sailing back. So after sailing out to sea for about an hour, I picked a spot for us to stop and cast our lines. We brought a radio and tons of beers to make the time more pleasant. The sun started to set, and seeing the sun setting in the horizon with no visual intrusions was a beautiful sight. Perhaps the last pleasant thing that would happen that night.
By the time the sky was completely dark, we had already packed our stuff for the night and were inside the cabin playing cards and eating burgers. Mid-conversation, Jack stopped me and told me to listen. There was the sound of a boat motor out in the distance. We left the cabin to look into the horizon, but with no moon. It was just too dark to see more than maybe 50 feet in front of us. But over the calm waves, we did hear a boat motor. Whoever was out there didn't have their lights on. The lights in my cabin were on, which was definitely enough for anyone to see us and avoid hitting us. We were expecting the sound of the other boat to sail away into the night. However, it seemed to circle us for a bit, then abruptly stop. The motor just cut, and there was nothing but the sound of the calm water splashing against the boat. Jack started acting a little paranoid. He thought we were being stalked. He wanted me to use the spotlight to look for where this boat could be. I didn't want to do that because that would be a bit obnoxious and obvious. To make him happy though, I started to drive the boat for a few minutes away from the last direction we heard that engine stop. Although maybe I did it because I was a little suspicious about it as well. After a solid 5 minutes of driving the boat in the opposite direction, I killed the motor and we went back inside the cabin to resume playing cards. It felt like only seconds after we sat down, we heard it again. This time I heard it first, but it sounded like the motor was being given much less gas. We went outside again, and at that instant the sound stopped. This time I agreed with Jack. Turning on the spotlight was a necessity now. The spotlight only rotated 180 degrees, so I turned the boat a little to the right so that I could point the light out in the direction we heard the boat. The beam of light shot far into the horizon. I felt my heart racing as I slowly turned the light to point more to the right, and finally I stopped when the light started to land on a boat floating not too far away from us. I turned the light off at once and told Jack to turn the cabin lights off as well. I put the boat in full throttle and sped away from the area. I steered the boat for about 5 to 10 minutes before thinking it was enough. We hung out outside for a while to ensure we weren't followed again. When it seemed safe to do so, we went to sleep. However, I awoke to a thumping coming from above my head, above the cabin. I looked over at Jack, sleeping on the couch. I whispered his name a few times to wake him up, and I pointed up at the ceiling. He looked up, then back at me, with a look on his face telling me he heard the thumps. I opened the door to the deck and ran outside, and saw 2 men, one on the bow of my boat, the other on a boat floating directly next to mine. Jack came running out behind me. Both of the men slowly put their hands up in front of their faces and claimed they meant no harm. The one on my boat said they were simply almost out of gas and needed help. He said he was going to knock on my cabin door to ask for assistance, but in my head I was thinking, why was he on the bow of my boat then? I very low-key flicked Jack's thigh to indicate to him that I was getting ready to do something rash. The guy stepped down from the front of the boat to the lower deck, right in front of Jack and I. He was significantly taller and bigger than us. He looked at me for a few moments, and reached out his hand, expecting a handshake, without saying anything. I knew something was about to go down with these guys, and for all I knew, that could start with my shaking his hand. Instead of shaking his hand, I pushed the guy overboard into the water with all my strength. Then I ran up the stairs to turn the boat on, while I yelled at Jack to make sure they didn't get back on the boat. We were able to lose them in the night for good this time. I didn't stop though. I kept going the full 2 hours straight back to the shore. We made it back to my dock, and we slept on my boat that night. The next morning we packed up and drove home. Strange things can happen out at sea in the dark, but I never anticipated anything like that. I don't know what those guys were planning on doing to us on my boat, but considering they had been making a point of stalking us, I know it was nothing good. A few years ago, I went on a Norwegian cruise with a few friends. It started out as a great little vacation. However, by the 3rd day at sea, things started getting weird. After 2 days of eating constant sushi, I started to feel a little dizzy and lightheaded at times. My friends told me no more sushi, as it probably had something to do with that. But anyway, after a few drinks, I separated myself from my friends who were sitting in one of the ship's many bars and started walking back to my room because I really wasn't feeling too well. I took some weird lower deck route back in the direction of my room though, since some of the bars were on the lowest public levels of the ship. I asked one of the maids in the hallway which way was the quickest to get to the certain section my room was in. The maid had a very thick accent, but I understood her to have said keep going straight, then make a left at the sign. So I did that. I came to a sign that I don't remember what it said, but it was a sign, so I turned left. There I was in some narrow hall with a tiled floor instead of carpeting. It didn't seem like the right way to go at all. It seemed more like an employees only section. Still, I figured I'd give it a chance before turning back, and continued down this narrow hall. I came to a corner, then looked to my right, and here was the creepiest hallway you could possibly find on this ship. Half the lights were out, one was flashing on and off, but at the end of this tiny hallway was someone standing facing the wall. My head started to hurt even more as I saw this. I had to rub my eyes to make sure what I was seeing was real, but when I moved my hands away from my eyes, the person standing by the wall was now looking at me. Considering they were standing in the dark section of this hallway not lit up by lights, I couldn't really see much about their actual face, other than I knew they were looking at me. I turned and went back the direction I came. I walked back down the hall. The maid was gone now, however, so with my head still killing me, I managed to get back to the lobby of this floor, and at that point finding the elevators was easy. I made it back to my room easily at that point and crashed into bed. I was sure I had gotten food poisoning from the sushi because my stomach was also hurting along with my head. But anyway, I woke up at some odd hour in the night and I couldn't move. The only thing I could move were my eyes. I tried looking around the room, but my inability to move my head or sit in an upright position made seeing a lot of the room difficult. Then I remember something seemed to appear in my peripheral vision. I turned my eyes to the opposite side of the room, and there was a figure facing the wall. As I looked at it, I wanted to scream or run, but I couldn't do anything. It was as real as could be, like I knew I was seeing it. Then the head of the figure turned around to face me, but all I saw was black. The body, the face, everything about this figure just looked black. The figure started to move closer to me. The most disturbing thing about it, though, was that as it moved towards me, it didn't move its limbs. It seemed to just slowly float towards me. The figure stopped over my bed, and now I could slightly see a face to it, and I recognized it as that person I saw earlier in the night in that hallway. I don't remember exactly how long that figure stood over my bed, but suddenly I saw its mouth open twice as wide as you'd expect to be humanly possible, and out came a deafeningly real scream. So loud that I think it woke me up completely from the sleep paralysis I was just in. The craziest thing I remember was the scream of this sleep paralysis figure fading into the scream of my own voice as I was finally able to make noise. I flicked on the light, and my friend, who was in the other bed, woke up asking what's wrong. I told him about the horrible experience I just had. He once again said I'd been eating way too much raw fish, and it was fucking with my head. My whole body was shaking and my voice was trembling. I went back to sleep and don't remember having another dream that night, but I still wonder if that person I saw in the hallway was real or not, because I'm 90% sure that's the hallucination I had in my paralysis. That hallucination was also the realest, most horrific thing I'd ever seen. I live on the east coast of the United States. Recently I moved to Florida from Georgia, and I figured it would take a couple days to sail my boat down there to our new waterfront house. I didn't have any cars with a tow hitch to carry the boat, let alone a trailer to carry it with, so sailing it seemed like the best option, while my wife finished up moving the rest of the stuff to our new house. I kissed my family goodbye and set sail. None of them were really willing to come with me on this adventure, and I didn't blame them. But anyway, I brought enough food and gas to last me the whole trip. The first day was a breeze. I got some sleep, then sailed for 10 hours the next day, with breaks in between, of course. By nightfall, I went to bed in the cabin. Sleeping in a rocking boat isn't exactly the easiest thing to do, so I was up for hours, rolling around on my sides trying to find a comfortable position, trying to press my head firmly enough into the pillow, thinking it would hide the unbearable feeling of the boat rocking over the ocean surface. Eventually, I heard sounds coming from above my head that I could best describe as small thumps. Did it sound like someone walking on my boat? I couldn't tell yet. With a medium-sized fishing boat floating out in the ocean, random sounds like creaks and thumps are going to be made. But these thumps were coming so rapidly and consistently, I started to get sick with the thought that someone out this far could be on my boat. I had to get out and look, but I wanted to be quiet. So I opened the cabin door very slowly, but before I could even open it all the way, I heard a big splash in the water. It sounded to me like someone or something jumped into the water. I was honestly scared I wasn't alone, even though it made no sense to me. I didn't want to go outside, but I felt I should move the boat away from whoever or whatever was out there in the water. So I ran outside to the cockpit and started the boat engine. I gave the boat some gas and got myself the hell away from there. Immediately, I heard my boat bump into something in the water. Not something heavy enough to cause any kind of impact, but heavy enough to hear it and slightly feel the boat bump. I didn't see what it was because, to be honest, I wasn't paying attention to whatever was out in the water. Plus, the lights weren't on. Anyway, I sailed for a few hours in the deep night because I was wide awake anyway. When I started to get tired, I killed the motor and went back to bed. Emphasis on the word bed, not sleep. Because even though I felt tired, I was still having trouble falling asleep. I figure half an hour passed and I started hearing more thumps. This time the thumps seemed louder and more clear for some reason. In a split second, my heart started racing again. The thumps were consistent and deliberate sounding again. No way it was just boat noises. I felt like I was being followed by someone. I couldn't just sit there and hide in the cabin like this all night. I had to sum up the courage to go outside again. But when I checked, there was no one on the entire boat. Was it my imagination? Were the sounds really just coming from the boat? I decided that must have been the case, and once again went back inside the cabin to bed. I lay there, extremely silent now, trying to listen for any little noise. And when I did this, I heard something. I knew I did. It wasn't the sound of thumping or anything like that. I had to perk up my ears to really pay attention, and I figured out what I was hearing. It wasn't the sound of the wind outside or the water hitting the boat. It was the sound of someone breathing. It was not the sound of my breathing, but someone else's. It was coming from inside the cabin, of course. I panicked, but I tried to maintain composure so to not make it obvious. I got out from the bed, walked outside the cabin, and locked myself in the cockpit. I intended on sailing until I could find a dock by the shore. There's a small window that looks into the cockpit from the cabin. It has a curtain. I turned every minute or so at least once to look back at it, expecting to see someone watching me. And one of the times I looked back, I did see someone. The curtain was curved up a little bit in the corner, and I saw someone's eye, and maybe a quarter of their face peeking into the cockpit. I turned away right away, acting like I didn't see them. I had the thought, what if it was my young son trying to scare me? But it wouldn't make sense. I saw him waving goodbye when I set sail from the house. It was 3 or 4 tense hours of hell, thinking at any moment someone could break into the cockpit and stab me, but I made it to shore and sailed through the narrow canal. I had already called the cops 15 minutes earlier, requesting they have a few officers waiting at the dock I was headed to. It was still dark out, but I saw people standing on the dock, and I couldn't have been more excited to get there. When I stopped the boat next to the dock, I came out from the cockpit screaming at the officers to help, pointing at the cabin door. The 2 officers went into the cabin with their hands on their pistols, and 10 seconds later, I heard them yelling at someone.
They pulled out some guy with really long, gray, wet hair and a similar beard, wearing wet, skinny, ripped jeans and a gray t-shirt. They had him in cuffs as they walked him past me. He looked at me and just laughed this insanely off-putting laugh. The guy looked and sounded like a meth head, the best way I could describe him. The police questioned him, but he never answered anything as to how or when he got on my boat, or what he was trying to do. But thinking back, when I heard breathing in my cabin, it's likely he was hiding under my bed, and that's the most horrifying thought imaginable. By then, I was exhausted. I went back to my cabin and fell asleep right away. By late morning, I made it to the new house, and my nightmarish adventure was over. This happened back when I was 17, my last Halloween at home before going away to college. It was Halloween in our peaceful town where nothing bad ever happens. Our house is in the wealthier side of town, and while our house would be described as gorgeous by anyone not from the area, the real head-turner is our next-door neighbor's house. It sits on that line of being called just a huge house or a mansion. They always go crazy with their decorations for any holiday, specifically Halloween and Christmas. This one year was no exception. By October 1st, they already had all their crazy decorations out. Some houses go the cute and innocently spooky route, like with smiling ghosts and blow-up decorations. But our neighbors go the actual scary route, with the fake graves, fake bloody body bags, actually scary-looking fake corpses, etc. It actually draws a lot of attention. People know to drive by and take videos, so it's never uncommon to see cars just sitting in front of their house in the middle of the street from time to time. I'll rename my neighbors' names to Mike and Donna just to not blow up their spots even more. Fast forward to Halloween Day. It was luckily a Friday this year, so that meant parties and all that could be held on actual Halloween. My dog Bear sleeps downstairs in the corner of our dining room, and he woke me up really early morning, like 4 a.m. when it was still pitch black outside. He was barking at something outside. I yelled across the house to shut up, Bear, and my mom came out into the hall and did the same. Bear stopped barking after this, but I had no idea what he was barking at. I fell back asleep quickly after that, then woke up to my alarm like 2 hours later. So I started getting ready for school as my dad was leaving for work, and as he stepped out onto the front deck, he came back in and got mad at me and said, "Damn it, Zach, clean up the dog's shit." He thought I let our dog crap in the front of the house for some reason. I told him I definitely didn't though. He was in a hurry, so he left without more arguing. Next up, it was my turn to leave for school, and as I left the house, I got a whiff of something kind of unpleasant. I now knew what my dad was talking about. I didn't see any dog crap anywhere though. Later when I got home around 2, I still smelled that smell. I had no idea what it was, but it was really starting to stink. My parents were both at work, and my parents wanted me to hand out candy when trick-or-treaters started coming. It wasn't until around 4 to 5 that they started coming. When I opened the door to the first few trick-or-treaters, I'd get a whiff of that increasingly horrible stink, and the kids and their parents clearly smelt it too because they were all commenting on it. One parent told me it was even worse next door. I started to know whenever to expect the doorbell to ring because I'd hear groups of people pointing out how horrible it smelt. At one point, I saw Mike and Donna in front of their house, looking around. So I went outside and went over to ask them if they smelt that too, but that was hardly a question because it got worse on their property. It clearly was coming from the front of their property, but there wasn't any dog crap or anything. The smell was coming from one of the body bag decorations, only it apparently wasn't a decoration. The couple had a number of fake body bags leaned on things like the mailbox and their front tree, but there was one just laying flat on the ground, and Mike said to Donna that he didn't put that one there when she asked. The smell was unbearable from this bag. Mike ran to grab a knife and cut the bag open, and what we saw made me sick. He of course cut the top of the bag open, revealing the rotting face of an actual human corpse inside the bag. We all put our hands over our mouths in disgust, wanting to throw up. And of course, there was an audience of kids and parents to see what was going on. It became a huge scene. Mike called the cops, and their whole front yard literally became a crime scene with people gathering from all over to watch, even though the cops kept telling everyone to clear out. The body was taken away. I told the police that my dog Bear was barking last night at like 4 a.m., and he may have been barking at whoever dumped the body there. Mike told my dad a week later that the body turned out to be a local 30-something-year-old guy who had taken his own life. As for who dropped the body there or why, that's unclear. Mike and Donna are very likable people, so we all think it was somebody who just looked at them as some rich, snobby household that overdoes it with the decorations for attention. Obviously, there are some sick people out there. I'm a single 24-year-old female living alone in my grandma's house. The house was basically left to me after she passed away because my mom didn't want to sell it and she also doesn't want to move out of her house. So I get to stay in my grandma's house alone. This was last year, Halloween. My first one living in the house alone. I considered just leaving a bowl of candies on the stoop, but I figured that was not the best way to associate a friendly face to the house that I was new to living in. The day went pretty normally. Halloween was on a Sunday, so the trick-or-treaters started coming early on in the day, and it continued all day. Some people asked if my grandma was home, sadly unaware that she had passed away. I explained to those people that I'm her granddaughter, and that I live here now. My grandma was a very loved lady, so it was no shock to me how many people asked about her that day. Mostly everyone who knocked on the door was very friendly and normal. Later on that night, past 9 o'clock, when the trick-or-treaters had dwindled down almost completely, I heard a voice outside the front door say trick-or-treat. No knocking or ringing the doorbell. I was in the kitchen, so I definitely would have heard any knocking, but it did seem possible that he thought he pressed the doorbell but didn't. When I went out to greet him, I saw it was this average height guy in a purple suit and creepy plastic mask. I don't really know what the costume was supposed to be, but it was interesting, I guess. When I opened the door, he said trick-or-treat again, but the strange thing was I could tell the guy was a bit older, like a full-grown adult. He was changing his voice to be a little higher pitched, like he was trying to sound younger. It was strange. I assumed he may have had some issues, so whatever. I asked him what his costume was supposed to be, but he didn't answer. We just made eye contact through his mask. I took 2 pieces of candy and dropped it in his pillow sack he was holding, which looked completely empty. That was the part that weirded me out the most. He looked into the sack, then back at me. I said have a good night and closed the door. That was weird. He was the last trick-or-treater of the night. I wondered if he was accompanied by anybody watching over him, because I assumed he was special needs or something. He was clearly a 30-something-year-old man behind that mask. The rest of the candies I just left on the dining room table. Halloween was over. Or so I thought. The next night, around the same time as the previous night, I heard a loud trick-or-treat at the front door. That same creepy fake high-pitched voice. I had to have imagined it, I thought. But when I went to check through the peephole in the door, it was him again, in the same costume, and by the looks of it, he had an equally empty pillow sack as the night before. I didn't open the door, no shot in hell. A few minutes later, I heard him shout trick-or-treat again. I ignored it. In fact, I shut off the living room lights to basically say, hey, get off my stoop, I'm not answering the door. I went upstairs to my room and shut the door and started watching TV in there instead. Out of sight, out of mind. Until I heard a pop at my window. Something was thrown at it, like a rock. I muted the volume on the TV, and a few seconds later, I heard the familiar trick-or-treat. I suddenly was in panic mode. Why was he doing this? I went to the window, lifted it up, and looked down. That man in the purple suit and mask was looking up at me. I threatened him with calling the police. In response, he very slowly lifted his empty-looking pillow sack up and held it open. It seemed he was some asshole trying to scare me, but Halloween was over, and I wasn't amused. I called 911, and police showed up in under 10 minutes. The guy was still outside. He refused to talk to them, so they put him in handcuffs and took his mask off, and as I figured, he was some creepy-looking 30-something-year-old guy. They told me they were bringing him down to the station, but apparently they let him out within 48 hours, because 2 nights later, he came back to my house, this time at the backyard door. He never knocked or rang the bell. He'd just stand outside with his empty sack and costume, creepily yelling trick-or-treat. I called the police again and told them he's back, and once again the police came and arrested him. I swear to God, a week later the man had returned once again, throwing a rock at my window. This time when I called 911, he seemed to actually disappear before the police had gotten there. But regardless, it seemed the police didn't really care to do anything. Either that or they couldn't. Luckily, I think the man lost interest because he hasn't returned since then. At least as far as I know, unless he's been hiding in my bushes watching me, which is disturbing to imagine. Halloween is coming up, and I'm kind of nervous he's gonna come back. I was 10 years old in 5th grade. I was planning on going trick-or-treating with my friend Jordan. We already knew the route we were going to take. It was the first year that we were being allowed to trick-or-treat alone. My mom gave us big bags for candy. It was a weekend night, so we could luckily stay out later. We did some day trick-or-treating, and after about 2 hours, we went back to my house and took a break. My parents ordered Chinese food for dinner. Jordan stayed for dinner. Then around like 7 or 8, we went back out for some night trick-or-treating. My parents wanted us to stay close. We obviously said yes to that, but we kind of strayed off a different, further away route that we knew less kids would go down. Everything was going as normal. Less houses would open their doors after dark, we noticed though. But there were still some kids out trick-or-treating since it was the weekend. One house we got to, we rang the bell, and within like 10 seconds, as if he were waiting by the door, a man opened up. Looking back, he was a bald man, looked like he was 45, and had a small gap between his 2 front teeth that we noticed when he smiled as he opened the door. He was overly friendly from the start, complimenting our costumes, trying to ask us where we're from, and just being overly conversational. We just wanted candy. He eventually said he has the candy inside if we want to come in for a second, followed with he wanted to show us this cool Halloween decoration he had inside. He described it as some talking skeleton trapped in a cage begging to be let out. Jordan and I weren't comfortable going inside this man's house though, obviously. When we said that in not so many words, he said he understood, and asked if we wanted to come in real quick just to pick out the candies that we wanted. We said it's fine, he could just give us whatever. He tried to insist one more time, and we said no, and he said no worries, then went inside to grab us some random candies. They were these chewy candies wrapped in see-through wrappers. We thanked him and left. As we walked away from his front door, we noticed he didn't close the door. He just watched us as we left. We walked away from his house down the sidewalk, and after another glance back, we now noticed he was walking in front of his house slowly with his hands on his hips. We considered running away, but there were other people down the block, so nothing would happen most likely. We just skipped the next house and went to the house 2 doors down. A woman answered, and we told her about the creepy man 2 doors down. She said she didn't know him at all, but that we should tell our parents when we get home. We ran into these 2 kids going in the direction of the creepy man's house, and we stopped them and warned them not to go there, and their reaction said it all. They already went to his house too, and had the same exact thing happen to them. They looked to be our age as well. We asked what candy he gave them, and it turned out to be the same candies. They already threw theirs away, so we dug into our bags, found them, and threw them away as well. If anybody would be sus enough to lace candies, it would be a guy like that. We wondered what exactly that man was trying to do if we were to have actually entered his house. Like, was he actually just innocently trying to show us something, or did he have other intentions? Our question was answered the next day, because that man ended up on the news for attempting to lure kids into his house, claiming he had a new puppy. It seemed his story changed for different kids, possibly based on their ages. Thank God it sounded like everyone was smart enough to not enter the man's house. This happened last year. I was 22 at the time, completely burnt out from work, and I was going through one of those stretches where everything in life felt like it was happening to someone else. I won't get into specifics, but let's just say I had a colorful past, and by that point, I was actively trying to put some distance between myself and certain chapters of my life. What I needed more than anything was to disappear for a few days. We've all been there. I must have been venting out loud because one day at work, I found myself having a conversation with a coworker about this tiny island off the coast of Maine. The way he described it, the place sounded almost aggressively boring. No nightlife, barely any tourists after dark, and most people just took the ferry out for the day and left before sunset. He said if you stayed overnight, it was like having the whole island to yourself, which was exactly what I was looking for. I found a vacation rental listing for a standalone cottage right on the shoreline. The price was suspiciously cheap, and it was available on short notice, which probably should have raised some flags, but I wasn't exactly in a cautious headspace. I booked it without thinking twice. The cottage itself was small, just a single room with a bed, an unused kitchenette, and a bathroom the size of a closet. It was set back from the water, surrounded on 3 sides by thick brush that pressed right up against the walls. The front faced the ocean with a single window covered by this thin, semi-translucent curtain that didn't do much to block the view in either direction. The walls were paper thin. I could hear the wind moving through the brush like it was right next to my ear. The door had a deadbolt and a chain lock that both looked like they'd been installed recently, which struck me as a little odd for such an isolated spot, but I didn't dwell on it. I took the late afternoon ferry over and spent the early evening just walking around the island. It was kind of surreal watching the place empty out as the day visitors filtered back to the mainland. By the time the sun went down, there was almost no one left. No streetlights, no ambient noise, nothing. I was pretty much left alone to enjoy the sounds of the ocean by myself. It was beautiful. I grabbed dinner at this little pub near the ferry landing. The bartender was friendly enough, but I noticed that she gave me a weird face when I told her where I was staying. On the walk back, I passed a small dock tucked into a cave maybe 100 yards from the cottage. There was a single blue motorboat moored over there. It stood out because all the other boats I'd seen on the island were larger lobster vessels. I made a mental note of it, but didn't think too much beyond that. I got back to the cottage around 10:30, locked the deadbolt and the chain, and settled in for the night. Up until that point, I was really enjoying the time away from everything. But of course, that peace didn't last. I realized my phone charger was busted, or maybe it was the outlet I was using. But the point is, my phone wouldn't charge no matter what I tried. I tried every outlet in the cottage. My phone was on low battery, and I was 100% sure it was going to die within the hour. Luckily, I didn't really need it to get back to the ferry. I had a physical ticket, but no one likes having a dead phone. I decided to just call it a night and go to sleep. I was exhausted anyway, and I did fall asleep pretty quickly actually. The exhaustion from the past few nights hit me all at once, and I was out within a few minutes of my head hitting the pillow. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I don't know what pulled me out of my sleep exactly, but once I was awake, I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside the cottage. They were close, right in front of the door, and whoever was out there was taking their time, which I could tell because there was a long pause in between each step. It definitely didn't sound like an animal scurrying around. I shifted in bed just slightly, and the footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't really describe. It stretched on long enough that I started to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or that it really had just been an animal. I didn't want to move, so I just stared at the ceiling in that same position. I'm not sure what I was waiting for, but I was so freaked out that I couldn't even think straight. And a few minutes later, the footsteps came back. This time there was no mistaking the direction. They weren't passing by, they were approaching. I heard them come right up to the entrance of the cottage and stopped directly in front of the door. At that point, my heart was damn near pounding out of my chest. I felt like they could hear it, but there was nothing I could do besides try and be as silent as possible. As if the situation wasn't bad enough, whoever was out there turned on a flashlight and tried shining it through the front door. I couldn't move because I was petrified in fear. That person clicked off the light and tried the door handle. I shut my eyes and prayed the deadbolt would hold, and it did. I thought that would be enough of a deterrent, but I was wrong. A few seconds passed, and then they tried again, putting more weight into it this time. Then came several hard bangs, one after another. The sound was so loud in that tiny little cottage that I actually flinched with each impact. The bangs activated my brain though. The threat was more real, and even though I was still terrified, I knew I had to do something. So without thinking, I jumped out of bed while that person was still banging on the door and crouched down behind it. I was fully prepared for what was about to happen, but instead of that person bursting through the door, everything went quiet. I stayed crouched down for a few seconds, trying not to breathe too loudly. And then, and I still remember this vividly, whoever was on the other side of the door spoke. "I know you're in there, Leo." I almost yelled out in shock, but I stopped myself. It was a man's voice, one I didn't recognize, but he somehow knew my name. He knew I was there. The footsteps moved away from the door and along the side of the cottage. I tracked the sound as it passed the bathroom wall and continued around. He was taunting me. He knew I was in there. My confidence was gone. Hearing my own name was enough to make me dizzy. It was the scariest moment of my entire life. Over the next stretch of time, I have no idea how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, Whoever was outside circled the cottage. I had no idea what they were doing, and a part of me was screaming for them to just break down the door and get it over with already. Eventually, the footsteps receded from the cottage. Then, from the direction of the dock, I heard an engine start. It was the unmistakable sound of a small outboard motor. I listened as it pulled away from the shore and faded into the distance across open water. I didn't sleep after that. That's not an exaggeration. I stayed awake the entire night. The second it was bright enough to see, I was out the door. The gravel around the cottage told the whole story. There were heavy boot prints circling the cottage multiple times. The prints led in a straight line from the cottage toward the dock and ended right at the waterline. The next day was honestly a blur. I returned the key to the property owner, boarded a ferry, and made it home. But I was not in a good headspace. Here's the thing that still gets me. Whoever was outside that cottage didn't come from the island. They came by boat, specifically to that cottage, and on that specific night. They knew my name and exactly where I'd be. The thing is, I have absolutely no idea how they could have tracked me down. I confronted my coworker about it a few days later, the one who told me about that island in the first place, and he swore up and down he hadn't told anyone about my trip. And honestly, I believed him. He looked genuinely freaked out when I told him what happened. I mentioned earlier that I have a colorful past. I'm not going to get into the details, but let's just say, I'm not exactly shocked that someone out there might want to find me. What I still can't wrap my head around is, how did someone track me to some random island off the coast of Maine? How did they know which rental I'd booked, and on which night? How long had they been watching me before any of this? I don't have any answers to any of those questions, and the worst part is, I still work the same job and live in the same place. Nothing has changed since then, but I have no reason to believe things are over. This happened many, many years ago. I'm a structural engineer, and at the time I was finishing up my graduate thesis on concrete degradation in marine environments. It was very boring, but it's what got me invited to Japan. This is all relevant, by the way. I was in Nagasaki for an academic conference. There was this professor I'd been corresponding with who had done extensive research on post-industrial decay. His name was Dr. Yamamoto, and he pulled some strings and arranged something I never thought I'd get access to, a research permit for Hashima Island. If you don't know Hashima, you've probably seen pictures of it without realizing. It's this tiny island off the coast of Nagasaki that looks like a battleship, completely covered in crumbling concrete apartment blocks. It used to be a coal mining operation, one of the most densely populated places on Earth at its peak. They abandoned it in the 70s when the coal ran out, and it's been rotting ever since. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Tourists can technically visit, but only on guided tours that stick to a narrow concrete path along the seawall. Civilians are expressly forbidden from entering the actual buildings due to structural integrity concerns. But I wasn't subject to the same restrictions, of course, which was thrilling and a little scary. I had to sign an exhaustive stack of papers, basically waiving my right to damages should I injure myself or something. The morning of the visit, I took an early ferry from Nagasaki. It wasn't a tourist boat, but rather a smaller vessel arranged through the research office. It was just me and my escort, a guy named Takeshi. He didn't talk much. I didn't really mind because I was so hyped about the excursion. The approach to Hashima plays tricks on your eyes. When it first appears within your line of sight, it looks deceptively small, insignificant almost. But then, as you get closer, the scale of it hits you. The seawall wrapping around the entire island, the apartment blocks stacked on top of each other. It really is something else. I had seen hundreds of photos, but none of them prepared me for actually laying my eyes on what I can only describe as a true wonder. Takeshi gave me the briefing on the dock. I had access to several buildings beyond the normal tour route. He actually had a list, but there were still rules, such as stay on designated paths, don't enter anything marked with red tape, don't remove anything, don't touch anything you don't need to, and stay within visual range of him at all times. He said that last part twice. I also had to wear a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and these bulky reinforced work pants that made it a little difficult to walk. Despite all the excess gear, the first couple hours were amazing.
I was taking photos, taking notes, completely in my element. Takeshi followed at a distance, occasionally glancing at his watch. He clearly wanted this over with. We entered one of the large residential blocks around midday. The stairs were intact, but barely. You could see daylight through the gaps in the landing. Takeshi waited on the ground floor while I went up, which I thought was a little strange given his whole stay within visual range speech, but I wasn't going to argue. It was kind of irritating having him follow me around anyway. I was on the 4th floor examining a section of wall where the concrete had completely separated from the rebar underneath when I noticed something off. The dust patterns were wrong. There was dust everywhere, obviously decades of it, but there was this path through it, like someone had been walking this route regularly. Not recently maybe, but often enough that the dust hadn't fully settled back. I followed it with my eye and realized it led to a room at the end of the corridor. I should have gone back down to tell Takeshi, which would have been the smart thing, but I was curious and wanted to check things out for myself. He probably would have just ushered me back downstairs anyway, depriving me of ever getting an answer, so I carefully walked over to the room and pushed the door open. I immediately noticed 2 things, both of which were incredibly unsettling. Firstly, there was this weird smell emanating from the room that I didn't recognize. It didn't really smell like anything natural, but I couldn't recognize it as any kind of human smell either. I know that makes no sense, but that specific smell was genuinely something I have never encountered before. The second thing was even more confusing. The wall I touched was hot, or at least noticeably warmer than any of the other surfaces I'd felt on the island. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to process it. You might be thinking the warmth was probably due to sun exposure, and yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's what I was thinking too, even though there weren't any gaps in the ceiling. And I figured the smell could have been animals, even though I wasn't aware that any animals even lived on Hashima. I went back down and mentioned it to Takeshi. His reaction was immediate and strange. He didn't ask me any clarifying questions or even seem that concerned. He just told me that what I saw was impossible, and that no humans or animals lived on the island. He didn't even ask me to take him to that room. When I insisted that he follow me so I could show him the smell for himself, he flatly refused. His reaction was really disturbing, to be quite honest. We continued the tour, and I started being much more observant every time he allowed me to enter a building. I kept noticing weird things, nothing fully revealing like clothes or anything like that, but weird markings and signs that something had been there. I say something because I didn't know whether I was seeing signs of a person or signs of an animal, which was the most confusing part. At one point, I mentioned more of these sightings to Takeshi, and this time he didn't even respond. Instead, he just pulled out his radio and spoke rapid Japanese into it. I had no idea what he was saying or who he was even talking to, but it was the first time he had used the radio since we got off the boat. When I asked him what he said, he told me he was checking the schedule. I obviously didn't believe him. But what was I supposed to do? Demand that he tell me what he said? I just ignored him, but I was significantly more unsettled after that. It was almost like he knew what was going on and just didn't want to tell me. We reached a taller residential block near the center of the island. Takeshi hesitated at the entrance. He actually stopped walking and stood there for a few seconds before following me in. I remember thinking that was weird. He'd been bored and impatient all morning, and now he was all attentive? But I didn't care. I wasn't going to let someone else's attitude stop me from exploring. The stairwell was narrow and dark, but structurally sound. We went up maybe 5 floors. Takeshi was right behind me the whole time, which felt like a change from his earlier indifference. And then, after walking into one of the corner rooms up there, I saw something that immediately validated all my previous concerns. Against one of the walls was a pile of blankets and a few empty bottles of water. There was no mistake about it this time. I was looking at definitive evidence of human habitation. I regained my composure after the initial shock and turned to show Takeshi. There was no way I was going to allow him to dismiss my claims this time. But when I stepped out of the room, he was gone. I don't know why, but seeing those items in that room didn't terrify me until I realized I was alone up there. It was like Takeshi having disappeared unlocked my brain, and only then was I able to process how scary the situation truly was. There was someone else on that island. I suddenly felt a very acute urge to strip out of my gear and scratch myself. My whole body was itching, and I was starting to freak out. I frantically made my way back to the stairwell we'd come up, thinking I'd just run down and end the trip short. But no, as if things weren't bad enough, I turned the corner and realized the stairs were blocked. There was a pile of rubble spilled across the landing, enough that I couldn't get through. I didn't have time to think about whether it had collapsed naturally or whether someone had piled it there purposefully. I just turned and ran. I ran past that room and down the corridor, praying that there was another stairwell somewhere close by. I didn't care about the structural damage anymore. I was so scared and didn't care about anything other than getting the hell out of there. As I was sprinting down the hall, I heard movement from somewhere behind me. It sounded like footsteps stepping out into the hallway. I didn't turn around, no chance in hell. I just kept running. The only problem was that it was like a maze in there. I was too scared to think straight, and I felt like I was running in circles. The whole time I could hear footsteps behind me. At first I thought it was Takeshi, but after a while I realized there were multiple sets of footsteps, which meant I was being followed by multiple people. I finally found another stairwell, and I practically jumped down it. I don't remember much about getting out of the building. I remember daylight and then sprinting across open ground and then the dock. Takeshi was just standing there by the boat. Seeing how unfazed he looked took me from scared to downright angry. I started screaming at him about what I had seen, about the people in that building, about him abandoning me, everything. I think I even accused him of piling that rubble up in an attempt to strand me in there. He barely even blinked. It was like he wasn't hearing what I was saying. I wanted to put my hands on him, but that would have been a terrible idea. He was my way off the island. He had all the power. I had none. The way he didn't even react to what I was saying only made me angrier. At one point, I actually kind of hoped that whoever had been stalking me in that building would turn a corner so Takeshi would believe me. He waited for me to finally calm down, and then instead of acknowledging anything I had said, he just said we were leaving. I didn't know what to think. I was still pretty unsettled and scared at what had just happened, but I was also horrified that this guy was refusing to acknowledge any of it. It genuinely made me think that he knew something about what had happened. Or worse, maybe he had caused it himself. Maybe he had been the one to pile that rubble. But the worst part was that I had to sit through an entire ferry ride back to the mainland with him. I was genuinely worried for my safety, but we made it back, and that was that. As soon as I got somewhere safe, the first thing I wanted to do was report my sightings, that there were people on Hashima. That was extremely concerning, so I contacted the only person I could think to contact, the only person who had any connection to both me and the island, Dr. Yamamoto, but I couldn't get a hold of him. Fast forward 2 weeks, I was back in the US at that point, and I still couldn't get a hold of him. It was like he had disappeared. I tried my best to report what I had seen to the relevant authorities, but I don't think anything came of it. I don't think anyone believed me. It's been years and years and years since this all happened, but this is a story I'll tell anyone who will listen. Strangely, the thing that gets to me the most isn't what happened on the island, but what happened after. The fact that I couldn't get in contact with Dr. Yamamoto, despite him going to great lengths to arrange my visit to the island. The thing I regret the most is not taking more action to get to the bottom of what was going on there. If I had spoken Japanese, or if I didn't have to return to the US so quickly, I might have been able to do something. This is something I'm gonna think about forever. This happened a long time ago. I'm talking 10 plus years. It was during my very last semester of college. I was majoring in history, and I was deep into my senior thesis, which focused on abandoned institutional spaces, places like defunct hospitals, asylums, rehab centers, especially ones that still existed in or around major cities. One of the cases I was writing about was North Brother Island. It was this overgrown island right in the East River, technically part of New York City, but it had been completely abandoned for decades. As far as I know, it's still exactly the same, but I haven't been in New York City in forever, so I really wouldn't know. Here's a very abbreviated history. It used to house a quarantine hospital, then a rehab center, and then at some point in the distant past it became off limits to the public. Unless something's changed, you still need a permit to even set foot there. In fact, it's probably even more heavily guarded considering how seriously the US takes security and whatnot these days.
That's all you really need to know about it, but for any fellow history buffs out there, feel free to do your own research. You might even find my thesis. I never actually planned on going, that would have been illegal, but I mentioned it offhand one night to two of my friends, Jansen and Jesse, while we were drinking. I was probably pissed at how long it was taking, knowing how lazy and unproductive I was back then. Surprisingly, they both thought my thesis sounded really interesting, despite the fact that neither of them were history majors. So I told them some of the interesting tidbits about the various places I was researching. The moment they realized one of the places was quite literally tucked away in the very city we were sitting in, they were hooked. Jansen and Jesse, and I guess myself by extension, were really into that whole urban exploring, edgy vibe back then. Back then, it was decently popular among young guys at the time. They both thought it sounded like the perfect target for an urban exploration trip, and I'll admit, after all the research I'd done, I was curious too. Not in a ghost hunter way or anything, but more like, if I was going to describe the place in my thesis, why not actually see it with my own eyes? Fast forward a few weeks, and that's how we found ourselves sneaking through Barretto Point Park in the Bronx at 2 a.m. with 3 solo kayaks in tow. It was one of the few spots along the shoreline where you could launch without attracting too much attention, and it was only about a half-mile paddle to the island. We had a bunch of supplies, probably more than we needed, but we figured we'd play it safe. The plan was to leave around 2:30, explore the island for a few hours while it was still dark, and be back before sunrise. It felt stupid and thrilling at the same time, the best kind of fun. Getting our kayaks into the water was surprisingly seamless. I guess I hadn't anticipated how deserted the park was going to be at that time of night. But as soon as we started paddling toward the island, the reality of what we were doing began setting in. There wasn't anything stopping us anymore. All we had to do was paddle at that point, and a bit of nervousness started creeping into what had just moments earlier been pure excitement. Regardless, we made it to the island. Pulling the kayaks onto shore was a bit of a struggle because of all the overgrowth. We had to push through some tall reeds and weeds just to find a somewhat stable spot to leave them. Once we were on solid ground, the three of us just kind of stood there for a second, taking it all in. It was dark, obviously, but we had flashlights, and the moon was bright enough that you could make out the general shapes of things. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it all was. I know that sounds cliche, but you have to understand, we were technically still in New York City. The Bronx was right there, maybe half a mile away, and yet it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. We started walking inland. It didn't take long for Jansen and Jesse to realize just how big the island actually was. I had told them beforehand that it wasn't some tiny little rock. I think I even showed them a map at some point, but they clearly hadn't internalized it. As we made our way deeper, we started passing building after building. Most of them partially collapsed or so overgrown that you could barely tell they were buildings at all. At one point, Jesse stopped and just stared at this one structure that had a tree literally splitting it in half. He said it looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic video game, like one of the ones where you're scavenging through the ruins of civilization. He wasn't wrong, that's exactly what it felt like. There was something almost alien about the way nature had reclaimed everything, like the island was actively trying to swallow any evidence that humans had ever been there. I remember thinking that if I didn't know better, I'd assume the place had been empty for centuries, not decades. We explored a few of the more intact buildings, shining our flashlights into rooms that hadn't seen visitors in God knows how long. Most of them were empty, but in one of the larger buildings, Jansen found something on the ground near a doorway, a half-empty can of spray paint. He immediately wanted to use it, and Jesse was on board. I told them no, that it felt disrespectful, not just to the buildings, but to the history of the place. People had lived there and people had died there, but they pointed out that there was already graffiti all over the walls, some of it pretty elaborate, and argued that a little more wasn't going to make a difference. I didn't have the energy to keep fighting about it, so I told them I wasn't going to stop them, but I wasn't going to stick around and watch either. In hindsight, wandering off was probably a mistake. I made my way through a few more rooms, trying to take mental notes for my thesis, but the further I got from Jansen and Jesse, the more unsettling everything became. It's hard to explain unless you've been in a situation like that. When you're with other people, even in a creepy place, there's a buffer. You can tell yourself it's fine because nothing bad would happen with witnesses around or whatever. But being alone is a completely different story. I was walking down a long hallway in one of the larger buildings. I think it might have been part of the old hospital complex,
when I heard Jesse's voice call my name from somewhere ahead of me, from one of the rooms further down the hall. The sound of it made me jump, and even though I knew it was him, I was still pretty freaked out. I started walking toward it, and something began to feel off. For Jesse to be ahead of me, he would have had to take a completely different route through the building. That wasn't impossible. There were multiple hallways and stairways, but it would have meant he left Jansen almost immediately after I did, and then speed walked or even ran just to loop around and end up in front of me. That didn't make any sense. Why would he do that? There were too many rooms branching off from the hallway, and I couldn't tell exactly which one the voice had come from, so I called out to him, asking where he was. I got a response almost immediately from a room just a few doors down on my left. It was definitely Jansen's voice, and all he said was, "In here." I walked toward it. The doorway was dark, darker than the hallway, which was already pretty dark, and I couldn't see anything inside. I figured Jesse and Jansen were probably just messing with me, trying to scare me for wandering off, which is exactly the kind of thing Jansen would think was hilarious. I stepped into the room without really thinking about it, and swept my flashlight around the room. It landed on a figure standing in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. For a split second, my brain tried to convince me it was one of my friends, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. Whoever this was, they were really tall, easily 6.5 feet, maybe more. Neither Jansen nor Jesse were anywhere close to that height. I can't express how scary seeing that figure was. I screamed. I couldn't help myself. I ran out of that room as fast as I could. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I was yelling for Jansen and Jesse to run as loudly as I could. I've never been more scared in my life. I felt like whoever had been in that room was going to catch me, or something else would jump out from one of the many pitch-black rooms I was running past. I found my friends near where we'd originally split up. When they saw me sprinting toward them, they just started running too. We didn't stop until we reached the kayaks. Once we caught our breath, I told them everything. They didn't believe me at first, which I completely understood. If Jansen had told me the same story, I would have assumed he was messing with me. But I pleaded with them to believe me, that I wasn't making it up, and after a minute or so, they actually started to look more scared than me. We decided to just leave. Whatever we'd come to see, it wasn't worth sticking around after that. But right as we started dragging the kayaks back toward the water, all three of us heard it at the same time. It was faint but distinct. A moaning sound coming from somewhere in the darkness behind us. It sounded like a woman, an older woman, either crying or wincing in pain. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough that we could hear it clearly if we focused. None of us said anything, but I could tell Jesse and Jansen were losing it. I was too. My hands were shaking. We finally got the kayaks into the water. The paddle back felt like it took forever, but we made it. The whole drive, none of us could stop talking about what happened. We went over every detail, trying to make sense of it, trying to come up with some rational explanation. But the thing I kept coming back to, the thing that freaked me out the most, was the voice. Because that was definitely Jesse's voice I heard in that hallway. I know Jesse's voice as well as I know my own, and whatever called out to me sounded exactly like him. Except Jesse was nowhere near that part of the building. He was with Jansen the whole time. I've thought about going back to the island over the years, but I never have. For one thing, I'm pretty sure it's basically impossible now. From what I've read, they've really cracked down on unauthorized access. Even if I wanted to, I don't think I could get within 100 yards of that place without getting intercepted by someone. I really don't believe in the paranormal, I never have, but I have a hard time explaining what happened that night any other way. Someone was on that island with us, someone who knew my name, someone who could make their voice sound exactly like Jesse's. I don't think I'll ever get an answer to what happened that night. I'll choose to be anonymous with this because it's pretty embarrassing, and also putting my name out there tied to this is likely a horrible idea. There was a Craigslist ad posted in 2017 by a guy named Jackson. He was advertising free lodging for a girl who would watch over his house and clean, basically an au pair or nanny without having to watch any kids. I'll just be honest that I kinda lost the will to do a lot when I was 21. I had zero relationship with my parents or sister, and I only had a handful of friends who I could trust. I dropped out of college my first year, part of the reason my parents hated me for a while, and I was working a dead-end job at a vape shop. I like to just refer to this period as my attitude era, and when I saw Jackson's Craigslist ad, it really caught my attention. It had like 10 pictures of his house. It looked like a modest middle-class house, slightly old-fashioned honestly, but I was into that. The pictures weren't what got my attention the most though. It was the fact that free living was offered for a nanny-type position. No background check required. I didn't even ask my family or friends their opinion on this post before I just decided to reply to it. Like I said, I wasn't exactly talking to my parents or sister at the time anyway. I texted the number on the ad, and this Jackson guy responded within a few minutes. I expressed interest in the listing and just asked some basic questions. He had an answer to everything that honestly made me feel more interested, but he asked pretty early on in the conversation what my gender was. When I said female, it almost seemed as though his responses got longer. I honestly didn't care. Most people tend to prefer having a female housekeeper or nanny anyway. I was still interested. Anything that got me out of my parents' house. He said he wouldn't be home most of the time during the day, but he wanted to come home to a clean house, and that he also wouldn't mind coming home to a cooked meal from time to time after work. Honestly, I was cool with that too. If it meant free housing, hell yeah, I'll cook some food. Beat standing in the wage cage at the vape shop. Plus, he also said he'd pay for the groceries. It was sounding almost too good to be true. He suggested I come by later that day to check the place out and see if it's a fit. I said okay. A few hours later, I was on my way in my crappy little Civic to the guy's house. It was in a perfectly normal side of town. The block actually seemed pretty calm and peaceful. The neighboring houses had flowers and decorations outside, suggesting the neighbors were normal too. Good start so far. I went to ring the bell, and when the door opened, I was greeted by a man larger and honestly older than I had pictured. I had pictured this regular 45-year-old dad-looking guy. Instead, it was a man maybe 60 years old, 6 feet tall, gray beard, and a little overweight. He greeted me with a smile and went in for a hug even though we had just met, and honestly, the amount that he laughed made me feel pretty at ease. He showed me around the house. It was a 2-story house. The first floor was your basic kitchen, dining room, and living room setup. Then the upstairs was 4 bedrooms and a bathroom. He only showed me the guest room that I'd be using and the bathroom upstairs though. The other doors stayed closed. He said if I ever needed to use the office across the hall, I was welcome to. Down the hall was his room and another room that he didn't explain. I was surprised to hear there was only 1 bathroom. Then there was the basement. He said it was unfinished and that he doesn't use it for anything other than working out and doing laundry. That was the end of the tour. He didn't show me the backyard that day. I told him I wanted the job, and he told me I was hired. 2 days later, I came back with my stuff. I told my parents I got an apartment when they asked where I was going. I didn't explain anything more. The first night there was when I noticed the cameras. No, they weren't hidden. At least, I don't think they were supposed to be. They were just small black cameras mounted up in the corners of the living room and the kitchen. It made perfectly normal sense to me. He was letting basically a stranger live in his house. It wasn't that crazy that he'd want some security. Still, I wish he had mentioned it. That was the first time I felt even slightly weird about the situation. If you can't tell, I really wanted this to work out. That night when I went to bed, I noticed how much noisier the house felt than when we toured it. I could hear the wood floors creaking every once in a while. At one point, I swear I heard what sounded like a door closing somewhere downstairs. I checked my phone, and it was around 1:30 in the morning. Again, I came up with a reason for this in my head. When you're laying in silence trying to sleep, you pick up on more sounds than you would when occupied by something during the day. Plus, every old house makes sounds like that. The next morning, he was already gone like he said he would be. He had left a note on the counter with a list of things he wanted done. It was normal stuff. He wanted me to do his laundry, vacuum the floors, wipe down the kitchen, and stuff like that. I tried to just focus on the fact that I wasn't standing behind a vape counter all day anymore. I did his laundry first, then I cleaned the floors and wiped everything down. After that, I went back upstairs and started setting up the bedroom more like my own space. I unpacked my clothes, set up my laptop on a small desk, and put a few personal things around just to make it feel less temporary. I remember thinking maybe this could actually work out.
I was actually being positive. After I finished everything, I just relaxed for a while and watched YouTube videos on my laptop. Not hearing my parents yelling downstairs or having one of them burst through my bedroom door barking orders at me was a breath of fresh air. The first week actually went pretty normal. At night when he got home, we would talk a little, like about basic stuff. It never really got deep. He asked about where I grew up, what I wanted to do eventually, stuff like that. I cooked dinner a few nights in a row, and he seemed to appreciate it. I started thinking maybe I just overreacted about the cameras and the weird feeling, but it didn't all stay happy and peachy. One night, I made pasta with chicken and some vegetables. I tried my best, but I'm not some housewife-type star chef. I was some young, angsty goth girl. When he got home, he looked tired and irritated. He took one bite and his whole face changed. He said it tasted bland. I said sorry and offered to add some seasoning or make something else, but he just kind of snapped. He said something like if I was going to be living there for free, the least I could do was learn how to cook something edible. He pushed the plate away and stood up. Then he told me to clean up the mess I made in his kitchen before he walked away toward his bedroom. It caught me completely off guard. It wasn't even just what he said, it was how fast his personality seemed to change. He had seemed so easygoing before that. I cleaned everything up quietly and hoped that he had just had a bad day and nothing more. Everyone has bad days. The next morning, I actually apologized to him. I didn't even really think I did anything wrong, but I wanted to keep things smooth. I told him I was sorry about dinner and I'd try harder. He just laughed like it was nothing. Then he said something that made everything weird. He said maybe I could make it up to him by cleaning the house in my underwear that day. He said it with a smile like it was supposed to be funny. I remember just kind of freezing for a second because I didn't know how to respond. I told him I wasn't comfortable with that, to put it lightly. He just laughed again and said he was joking and told me to relax, and then he went to bed. I remember standing there after he left feeling really unsettled. It was the first time I really thought maybe there was something off about him beyond just being moody. That was the first time I texted one of my close friends about what was going on. I told her about the living situation and what he said. She immediately told me I was insane for staying there. She told me to leave as soon as possible. I didn't want to though. As weird as it was getting, I still felt like I had more control over my life there than I did living with my parents. Going back there felt like failing again. The next Monday, I was leaving the house to go buy groceries with some money he had left for me. As I was driving, a car behind me started laying on the horn. I thought I did something wrong driving, but it kept following me. I pulled over because I started getting scared that something was really wrong. The car pulled up behind me, and a girl got out. She looked around my age. She walked up to my window and asked if I was living at that house. When I said yes, she immediately told me I needed to stay away from that man. Apparently, Jackson wasn't even his real name. She said she was the girl who had the same arrangement before me. She told me she eventually realized he had cameras watching her constantly. She said she started noticing he knew things he shouldn't know. She said when she tried to leave, he made it very difficult and kept asking questions about where she was going and when she was coming back. Then she told me one night she woke up and saw him leaving her bedroom. That part made me physically sick. Then she told me the worst part. She said he didn't even have a job. She said he lied about going to work every day, and she eventually realized he was still somewhere inside the house most days. I just sat there trying to process it. Every little weird thing suddenly started making sense. I asked her how I could leave without causing problems. She told me to act completely normal, to start slowly taking important things out so he wouldn't notice. She said when I leave, I should make it look like I was just running errands, and she told me not to confront him and not to let him know I knew anything. After she left, I just sat in my car for a few minutes trying to calm down before going back. When I walked back into the house, it felt completely different. I felt like I was being watched even more than before. That night, I checked the room carefully like she suggested. She was right. After a few minutes of looking around, I noticed something small on the top shelf of the closet. It was pushed away into the corner. When I moved a box, I saw a tiny black lens pointing outward through a small drilled hole. I just slowly put the box back like I didn't see it. Needless to say, I didn't sleep at all that night. I looked at the darkness of the room, wondering what I'd gotten myself into, and honestly, I'm glad I didn't fall asleep that night, because at some random crazy hour in the night, I heard my door creak open, and when I flipped to my side and looked at the door. It was Jackson. He noticed me look at him, and he apologized for waking me and closed the door. What the actual was that weirdo planning on doing? I needed to get out of there. The next morning, I started my plan. Every day, I would bring one small bag of stuff to my car. Just normal things and nothing obvious. 3 days later, I left while he was at work, and I never came back. Though if what that girl told me were true, who knows where he actually was? Maybe in the house somewhere. He texted me later asking where I was. I told him I decided to move back home and thanked him for the opportunity. He kept texting, asking why, and saying I should at least come talk to him in person. I never responded again. About a week later, I noticed something that still bothers me. I got an email notification saying someone had tried to log into one of my old accounts. The login attempt was from the same town his house was in. I changed everything after that. I don't know what his real intentions were, and honestly, I don't want to know. Nothing technically happened to me, but I really believe if I stayed longer, something eventually would have. If you ever see deals like that offering free housing from strangers online, just remember, nothing like that is ever really free. I hired her sometime around the beginning of last fall. I work long hours and live alone in a 2-floor house I bought a couple years ago. It's pretty small and yet still more space than I really need, and I started realizing I was falling behind on keeping it clean. Maybe I needed a girlfriend to keep the place clean at the time. No matter how much I told myself I'd get to cleaning the house, I never seemed to be able to. One night after work, I was just scrolling Craigslist and other similar sites and saw a listing for house cleaning. It was just a simple post saying independent cleaner, cash only, flexible schedule. I figured why not, maybe this was what I needed. I emailed and she responded the next morning. She said she usually did apartments but was fine doing houses too. We agreed on a day she could come by while I was at work. She asked a few normal questions like how big the house was and if there were pets. I told her no pets, relatively small house, and that I lived alone. Looking back, I wish I hadn't mentioned that last part so casually. She came the following Thursday. I met her quickly before leaving for work, and yes, before you ask, I hid anything of value in my lockable closet before leaving. She looked to be maybe 38. She seemed very quiet. She didn't really make eye contact much, but I just figured she was shy. I showed her around quickly, all the rooms I wanted her to clean upstairs and downstairs. I told her she didn't need to worry about my office room. She asked where I usually keep the cleaning supplies, and I showed her the laundry room. She asked if she could come regularly every couple weeks. I said maybe. I wanted to see how this first time went. Before I left, she asked what time I usually got home from work. I told her around 6 or sometimes closer to 7, depending on traffic. At the time, that didn't seem weird since she probably just didn't want to still be there. When I got home that night, the place honestly looked great. The floors and counters were shiny, and everything smelled like cleaning products. I paid her what we agreed, and she left. Nothing seemed wrong. For about a week, everything was good. Then it started. Maybe 6 nights later, I woke up around 2 or 3 in the morning. I'm not a great sleeper, so this wasn't unusual. What was unusual was I thought I heard a soft thump from downstairs. It sounded like maybe something settling or one of those random house noises you hear at night. Put simply, I ignored it, as most people do when they hear these sounds. A couple nights later, I woke up again, and this time, I heard what sounded like a cabinet door closing. Again, I just assumed I was half asleep and imagining things. I didn't go check. I definitely wasn't going to go walk around a dark house at 3 in the morning over something that was probably nothing. I wish I did. Over the next week, I started noticing small things that felt slightly off, but not enough to really alarm me. One morning, a kitchen cabinet was open a few inches. I figured maybe I left it that way. Another time, a chair at my dining room table seemed pulled out slightly. Again, I assumed I must have done it without thinking. One Saturday morning, I noticed the downstairs bathroom hand towel felt damp. Stuff like that kept happening. Small things that you could always explain away if you want to. Then the nighttime sounds kept happening, always soft enough to explain away. Once it sounded like a single slow footstep, but I convinced myself it was probably the wood floors adjusting. I started sleeping with my bedroom door shut instead of cracked open like I usually did. I didn't really want to admit I was getting uneasy, but I was. One night I woke up and was almost sure I heard movement right outside my bedroom, like pressure being shifted in the floor. I still didn't get up. I just stared at my door waiting to see if the handle would move. Yes, I was starting to get that paranoid. But nothing happened, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, I felt stupid for even being scared. I checked the house, and everything looked normal. Around this time, I texted the cleaner again about coming back since overall she did a good job, and I figured maybe I was just stressed from work. She came again another weekday while I was at work. It was the same routine. I left the back door unlocked for her. When I got home, everything looked clean again. She asked if I wanted to schedule something regular. I told her maybe once a month. Anything more than that seemed like a waste of money to me. About a week after that second cleaning, I started noticing food seemed to be disappearing slightly faster than it should. Like I lost my mind one night swearing to myself that there was at least one more yogurt cup in the fridge the previous night, and now it was gone. Bread slices seemed lower than I remembered too. I still was trying to explain these things away though. But one morning, I found a glass in the sink that I was almost positive I hadn't used. I lived alone and was single at the time, so there really wasn't anyone else it could have been. At one point, I wondered if maybe I was doing these things half asleep and not remembering. I even Googled stuff about sleepwalking. Things really changed one night when I woke up and clearly heard slow footsteps downstairs. I know what footsteps sound like compared to house settling noises. These were steps. I grabbed my phone and stopped to listen for a sec. After maybe 10 seconds, I heard what sounded like something lightly bump into a wall. I didn't go downstairs. I know some people might think that sounds stupid, but fear really does make you freeze sometimes instead of act. Or maybe I was picking flight over fight before even confronting the situation. I just stayed in bed, sitting up for half an hour, not hearing anything again, and finally convincing myself it was nothing. And looking back, I look at myself as a coward for that. Morning came, and that day I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. I even checked my basement, even though I never heard anything from there. Clear. A few days later, I noticed something that really bothered me. In my kitchen junk drawer, where I keep random things like batteries and takeout menus, I also kept 2 spare house keys on a small ring. One of them was gone. I got goosebumps when I considered the obvious possibility, but I kept telling myself no, it's not possible. I searched the whole house, but I couldn't find it. The cleaner had been alone in the house twice for several hours each time. I started locking my bedroom door at night after that. About 4 nights later, I decided to test something. I left for work like normal, but after driving a few blocks, I circled back and parked on the next street over. I walked back quietly and went in through my back door. I stayed upstairs and just waited. Around 11 in the morning, I heard something. The sound of my front door unlocking. I heard very soft footsteps come inside. I moved to where I could see part of the downstairs through the stair railing. It looked like her, the cleaner. She just walked in like she lived here. She didn't even have cleaning supplies. She went into my kitchen, opened the fridge, took out a drink, and sat at my table. She sat there quietly for a few minutes. Then she walked slowly around my living room looking at things. She picked up a framed photo of me and my brother and just stared at it. Then she walked toward the stairs. I backed up as quietly as I could into my bedroom and shut the door without making any noise. I honestly didn't know what to do. I didn't want her to know I was home yet. After maybe a minute, I heard her walk halfway up the stairs and then stop. I could see her shadow under my door. She just stood there not moving, as if she knew I was at the door. It felt like at least a full minute. With my mind racing, I decided it was now or never to confront her. I flung the door open, and I was not expecting her to actually already be standing mere feet away from the door, already looking at it, and now looking at me. But I quickly realized, now that I had a closer look, it wasn't the same lady. It was another Hispanic lady, yes, but her build, hair, and face were all different. There was something so bone-chilling about her face. She had this blank, nearly angry, hateful look on her face.
I didn't say anything, and neither did she. We just stood there for a few seconds before she slowly turned and walked back down the stairs like nothing happened. I heard my front door open and close a few seconds later. My heart was pounding and I was shaking. I think I was genuinely too nervous and shook to move or say a word. I waited maybe 5 minutes before even moving. Dialing 911 was almost difficult with how shaky my fingers were. The police came and I explained everything. I explained there were 2 different women. I gave them the phone number and email of the cleaning lady and any other info I could provide. The original cleaning lady stopped responding completely after that day. I replaced every lock in the house that same day. Like literally right after the cops left, I went straight to Ace Hardware. What still bothers me is the officer asking me if I had given anyone else a key, to which I told him no. He just said sometimes people like that don't work alone. I never hired another cleaner again. It's crazy to think that 2008 was almost 20 years ago, but here we are. For anybody who's too young to remember, the early 2000s were sort of like the Wild West for the internet in many ways. Back in 2008, I was in my early 20s, and honestly, I was a bit reckless. I was way too trusting, and I was the king of saying things like, "That could never happen to me." I just never really had that sense of urgency or anxiety that others had. That is, until one spring evening, when I experienced for myself firsthand that downright evil individuals really exist in the world. Facebook had just started to blow up, but most people I knew were still rocking MySpace. Social media was a thing, but not like today. We had all heard horror stories about the internet, but nobody I knew actually cared, or more accurately, we were all just incredibly ignorant. I bring all this up because perhaps the most insane thing about the internet at the time was a little website called Craigslist. Now, I know Craigslist is still around, but it's nothing compared to what it was back in the early 2000s. We didn't have websites like Marketplace, so if you wanted something, you went to Craigslist. We could find and purchase anything from small trinkets to vehicles and everything in between. You could even find work or odd jobs for some extra cash. I had heard from friends who used Craigslist all the time that it was the greatest website ever. They swore by it. I never had any interest in visiting the website until my life started to unravel a bit in the spring of 2008. I was living with my girlfriend, and with almost no notice, she dumped me and threw me out of the house. Thankfully, I wasn't living on the street or anything like that because I had friends who would let me crash at their place. I spent the immediate days after the breakup trying to find my own apartment, but it was proving harder than I thought on my $7 an hour salary. One of my friends, whom I had previously mentioned, who swore by Craigslist, told me to check it out for possible houses or even rooms for rent. I may have been reckless and ignorant, but surprisingly, that was a hard pass for me. I don't know why, I just didn't love the idea for some reason. However, I did start looking for furniture and items to eventually fill my place whenever I had a place to fill, since she kept everything after the breakup. At first, it was like a treasure chest of goods. I could finally see why people loved Craigslist. I literally could find anything I needed. I was finding deals left and right. My buddy had a massive garage that he allowed me to store my recently purchased furniture in until I found my own place. One afternoon, I was looking for a love seat or a small couch to store in the garage. I found a post from a guy named Keith who was selling a whole sectional for $45. He had a picture with the posting, and it was a smaller sectional sofa that could fit in most living rooms. Not to mention, it looked like it was in great shape. The price seemed too good to be true, but as I said, I was ignorant, and I just saw a cool couch and a low price tag. I messaged Keith, and to my surprise, he messaged me back almost right away and told me the couch was still available. He seemed friendly and trustworthy. Well, as trustworthy as anyone can be over messaging on the internet. He told me that he had gotten a new job in another state and he was just trying to sell, hence the low price. The reason seemed good enough to me, so we exchanged numbers and set up a time to meet that evening. A meetup that would go on to traumatize me for years and open my eyes to the horror that exists even in our own backyards. I pulled up to the house around 9 p.m. that night, probably a red flag for most, but not for me at the time. He told me he had some other work arrangement, so he couldn't meet until that time. It didn't seem weird to me.
The house was dark, and not just because it was dark outside. Everything looked desolate. It was a very run-down street with almost no street lamps. There were several houses on the block, and they were all just as dark and decrepit as Keith's house. I tried calling Keith several times with the number he gave me, but I just kept getting one of those automated responses that the number is no longer in service. Just as I was about to drive away, my phone buzzed. It was a weird number with a different area code. I answered, and I was greeted with a friendly and somewhat unnerving voice. His voice was deep and almost erratic. He called me fella and started apologizing about the phone business. He told me that he broke his phone a little while ago and he was calling me on his work phone. I was definitely a little weirded out, but not scared or uneasy. I was honestly more annoyed than anything. I realize hindsight is 2020, but at the time, when you're in these kinds of situations, your brain is just kind of working differently. I wasn't thinking about the worst. I was thinking about that couch. He told me to meet him around the back side of the residence, and he would unlock the back door for me. I didn't even question it for 1 second. I made my way to the back, and couldn't believe that it was still so dark. I figured this guy would turn on some kind of light for me. I got to the back door and just stood there for a moment. I didn't know if he just wanted me to walk inside or if he was coming outside to get me. I decided to call him again on what he said was his work cell. Instead of hearing the ring in my ear, I hear a generic ringtone coming from behind me. Not in the house, but from the bushes in the backyard. I hate to even say this, but this is the first time I finally felt some kind of feeling that something might not be right. Keith ran out from the bushes, waving his ringing flip phone, and with that strange voice, he told me that he was getting rid of some old food and he was just coming out to greet me. He said that he didn't mean to alarm me. He claimed that he liked to feed the squirrels and whatever other animals lived in those bushes. I told him it was fine and that I just wanted to see the couch so I could be on my way. In a cheerful voice, he said, "Of course." He skipped by me, almost stumbling as he passed me. We got to the back door, and it looked like he was struggling to open it. When he told me to meet him in the back, I just assumed that he was going to be opening it from the inside of the house. I didn't expect him to be trying to open the door from the outside. This was the first time I got a good look at Keith. At least as good a look as I could get in the limited light. He was older, but not old. I would say maybe late 50s. He was really skinny and had long white hair that was pulled back in a nasty ponytail. Worst of all, he smelled like a dirty ashtray full of cigarette butts. He pulled away from the door a little bit and asked if I could help him get the door open. He said sometimes the door would stick and he was embarrassed that he couldn't get it open. He told me to just use my shoulder and push the door as hard as I could. At this point, I knew something was wrong, but I was already in the moment and was just kind of going with the flow. I grabbed the doorknob and lowered my shoulder into the door. It didn't stick at all. In fact, as I lowered my shoulder to push it open, someone from the other side opened the door. I had so much momentum now that I lost my balance and fell to the floor. When I hit the ground, I heard Keith yell, "Now!" In the dark room, 2 other people emerged from each side and held me on the ground. I started to squirm, but it didn't matter. One of the guys holding me down was huge. Keith started to kick my face. One of the worst parts of all of this was the sheer darkness of the situation. I couldn't see anything, and that made everything feel so much worse. I could feel my body starting to get weak from Keith kicking me. He told the other guy to grab the tape, and I heard the sound of tape ripping. I couldn't even imagine what they planned on doing. What happened next is probably the closest thing to a miracle that has ever happened to me. During the struggle of me falling and being held down, I accidentally dialed my friend, the friend that I had been living with since the breakup. The sounds of him yelling hello were coming through the phone loud and clear. I decided to yell, "I'm in the back of the house, come and help me." Clearly a bluff. I was alone, but I wasn't sure if these guys knew that. I was hopefully trying to scare them into thinking I had someone else in the car with me. The big guy eased his grip and looked at Keith, who had stopped kicking for a brief second. That second was all I needed. I was able to free myself, and I ran out the door and back to my car. I could hear them chasing me, but I didn't look back. I shut the car door and locked it immediately before starting it. Just as I was peeling away, I saw the big guy clearly for the first time. He was bald and had one of those patchy beards. His eyes were the worst part. They were dark and looked lifeless. He was trying to open the door even as I was driving away. I just kept driving. I drove for hours before I went back to my friend's house. I was scared that somehow those guys were going to follow me, and I didn't want them to know where I was staying. I called my friend back and told him everything. I eventually called the authorities, but it was too late. The post was gone, and apparently, the cell phone was some sort of track phone, and Keith ditched it. I gave them the best description I could, but as far as I know, Keith and those two other guys are still out there in the world. What scares me every time I think about that night is when I think about their intention. This wasn't just a robbery. He lured me in with a $45 deal. Whatever these monsters wanted, it wasn't just money. It was so much worse. I start going down a rabbit hole in my mind, thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't somehow escaped. As I wrote this story, I'm well aware of the stupid choices I made along the way. I'm just so thankful I'm here to tell it. Back in college, my junior year, we lived in a suite on campus. There were 4 dorm rooms in this suite. It was half of my friend group in the suite, and we all shared a common room and a small kitchenette. Our friend Cody, who was originally in the suite with us, ended up moving off campus to an apartment with his friend, so the school automatically assigned us a replacement, unfortunately. It was this kid named Rodney. He seemed normal enough. He had blonde short hair, a patchy light beard, almost non-existent eyebrows, and he was really tall. Medium build, but like 6'4". He was in the far corner of the suite, next to my room. We each had our own room, so there was 4 of us in the suite. Rodney seemed to keep to himself the first few days, until one day, I came back from class and he was sitting in the living room. He said he had to tell me something, and then told me he has parasomnia, which was the reason he was transferred from his previous dorm. I didn't know what that was, until he explained that it's a sleep disorder that may cause him to talk or yell in his sleep due to night terrors, and he just wanted everyone in the suite to be aware of it so that we wouldn't feel uncomfortable. But to tell you the truth, that being the first real conversation I had with the guy made me more uncomfortable than anything. I was hoping I'd get to know him on a more personal level, not find out he has a sleeping disorder. I also didn't entirely get why he thought it was necessary to tell me that. I texted in the dorm group chat we made with Cody still in it if Rodney had told them as well about his sleeping disorder yet. They all said no, and followed that with laughter and confusion. When my other 2 suite mates got back later, we hung out in the common room and discussed why we thought Rodney's sleep disorder could have been the reason for him to be transferred from his previous dorm. Then, Rodney walked in and right past us after giving us a slight sup. He went to his room and shut the door. We had the TV on loud, so we whispered amongst ourselves about him. That night, I heard a knock at my door in the middle of the night. I asked who it was, to no reply. I ignored it, and I thought to myself, what if it was Rodney? The next day, I asked my friends if either of them knocked on my door last night, and they both texted me saying no. Cody was having a great laugh from all of this. I was already freaked out and was hoping this wouldn't be a regular thing because it was disturbing already. A few nights later, it got worse. It was the middle of the night. I had already woken up, checked my phone, and saw 2 a.m. I heard footsteps outside in the little hallway of the common area, and again, a knock at my door. I didn't answer this time. I knew it was Rodney, and he was starting to freak me out. He clearly was a heavy sleepwalker. I texted the group chat again right then and there at 2 a.m., telling them it just happened again. They didn't respond until morning time, saying they didn't hear anything. It must have been because Rodney's room was right next to mine. That day, I knocked on Rodney's door and asked him if it had been him knocking on my door in the middle of the night. He told me he had no recollection of doing so, but then apologized because he didn't mention that part of his parasomnia is sleepwalking. He told me it was completely harmless and to not worry, but I didn't exactly view it as completely harmless if it was waking me up in the middle of the night, freaking me out. A certain amount of time passed that I can't remember, probably less than 4 days. There hadn't been any other random middle-of-the-night knocks on the door, which I was happy about. But this story wouldn't be told if something else didn't happen. I woke up to noise in my room. I looked around the dark room and spotted Rodney, in the corner of the room facing the wall, muttering to himself. I said Rodney's name, and he turned in my direction and kept saying, "Open the door, open the door." I was genuinely disturbed. He looked in my direction, but it didn't seem like he was looking at me, rather through me. I saw a smile on his face, and I heard what seemed to be a small laugh as he walked out of the room and out of my view. I didn't know if I was supposed to wake him up or not. I know nothing about sleepwalking and sleep disorders. There was silence now. I grabbed my phone and was about to text my friends, but I was interrupted by this deafeningly loud banging on a door outside, accompanied with Rodney's voice screaming, "Open the door." He was screaming it like a maniacal madman. I ran to the common area and saw him at the opposite end of the hall thrashing his fists on one of our suite mates' doors. I ran to Rodney and started shaking him to wake up. My two friends came out of their rooms to the commotion as well, and we all started to shake Rodney until he stopped, looked at all three of us, and with this blank look on his face, said, "I'm sorry guys," and walked to his room and shut the door. The three of us stood there in shock, not even knowing what to say or do. A neighboring room must have called campus police because they showed up at our door. We had to tell them the truth. Rodney spoke with them for a while, then he went back to his room. I made sure not to leave my room unlocked again that night. The next day, Rodney was gone, without a trace of him ever having been there. Like I said, I know nothing about sleepwalking or any of that stuff, but that didn't look like sleepwalking to me. I don't know what was or is currently going on in that guy's head, but he needs to get help. I got along fine with my college roommate Stacy. She was a messy one sometimes, but other than that we had no problems. We'd lend each other stuff all the time. At our school we had bunk beds, which I think are kind of unusual in college dorms. I was on the top bunk because I was the lighter sleeper, and Stacy was always constantly getting up in the middle of the night, so she'd definitely be waking me up if I were on the bottom. There was this one night that still sticks with me to this day, only because I don't really know how to logically explain it. Stacy and I were in our room studying. I was at my desk and she was in her bed. I had a big presentation the next day for one of my classes, so I was just going over my talking points again. In fact, I practiced them to Stacy a few times, and she acted as my audience, then asking questions afterwards. She told me I could borrow one of her tops tomorrow if I need to for my presentation, as I didn't have any nice formal kinds of tops with me at school. After helping me review, she went back to her studying for a little more, then she went to sleep. I wasn't done studying, but as a courtesy, I turned off my desk lamp and went up to my bunk and kept studying there on my laptop. Stacy would snore sometimes, so when she started snoring, I knew she was asleep. I continued my studying and rehearsing for another half hour to an hour before closing my laptop screen, putting it at the end of my bed, then going to sleep. I woke up at like 5 a.m. when light was just barely starting to creep into the almost pitch black room through the windows. I heard Stacy down below me, walking around. I groggily said Stacy's name, and she answered with, "Mm-hmm." I asked her if I could still borrow a nice top to wear for my presentation later that day. She went, "Mm-hmm," again, and I heard her open her closet door. I said thanks. I looked down at her and saw her bent over in the closet. Then she got out and waved at me as she went to leave the dorm. The sound of the door closing snapped me out of my daze just a bit more. I remember grabbing my phone to check the time, and just to naturally check for any notifications. It was around 5 a.m. I wondered where Stacy could have been going. Most likely the bathroom, like she often would in the middle of the night. The waving was just a bit unusual, though. But then, I heard a snore from below me in the lower bunk. At first I thought I imagined it. Like, how could that be possible? I peered my head over the edge of the top bunk, and there was Stacy under the sheets. Did I just dream seeing Stacy in her closet? No, because I looked at the closet door and it was still open. I quickly hurried to the door to the room and went out to look into the hallway on both sides. There wasn't a soul in sight, but it had been at least 5 minutes since I heard the door shut. I shook Stacy awake and told her someone was just in our room. It took a few moments for her to fully wake up and snap to reality, which she then showed major concern for and rushed to check her closet for anything stolen. Nothing was stolen though. I still to this day don't know who that was or how she got in. I reported it to university police, but their investigation and review of the camera in the lobby of the building turned up nothing. But I know for a fact it wasn't a hallucination or dream.
It was my freshman year in the University of Alabama. I had gotten my roommate's information a few weeks in advance, and his name was Brandon. This was back in 2013. We had been in contact in the weeks before classes would start. However, due to family-related reasons, Brandon had to switch to a different school right before classes even began. So for the first weekend, as everyone else was meeting their roommates, I was unpacking alone, still not yet assigned a replacement roommate. I did meet some of the other kids on my floor though. They were nice. Then, that Sunday night, my roommate arrived. He was walking through the dorm hall with a backpack looking confused, and I asked him if he had just been transferred into this building, and he said yes. I asked him if he was in dorm number 5. That wasn't the actual number of my room, I'm just using that for the story. But he said yes, that was his room. So I shook his hand, gave him my name, and told him I was his roommate. He told me his name was Robert, but to call him Bob. Unusual, I'd never met someone named Robert who preferred to be called Bob. I led Bob to the dorm, in which I had already decorated and furnished on my side. His side was still empty. He plopped his backpack on his bed and looked at me and smiled for a bit, then said in a slight Turkish accent that he didn't have all of his stuff yet. He opened his backpack and pulled out a sheet which he threw over his bed. Since it was already past 9 and tomorrow was the first day of class, Bob and I just sat on our respective beds chatting. I tried to read his vibe at first, as you do when meeting a new person, let alone your roommate. I couldn't really get a good read on him though. He seemed a little quieter. He had this very deep voice and maybe a slightly awkward vibe to him, but I was purposely not judging because people can be nervous when meeting other people for the first time. Anyway, eventually, after talking for a bit, Bob just laid flat on the bed with the sheet on it and used his backpack as a pillow. It looked incredibly uncomfortable. I had no idea how or why he was doing that. I offered him a pillow and he accepted it. I eventually fell asleep past 10. And do you ever wake up to something but you don't know what it was? That happened to me that night. I was confused why I woke up because I didn't hear anything. But that was the freaky thing. It was dead silent in there, not even the sound of Bob breathing. I flipped to my side and screamed at the tall figure looming over my bedside. I came to the realization that it was Bob after he started apologizing and said that he was just going to the bathroom. My heart was beating like it was running a marathon. I couldn't even think to ask him why he was standing over my bed like that if he was just going to the bathroom. He apologized again as he went back to his bed. I told him it's okay. Needless to say, I was wide awake after that. I slept on my side with my back to him the rest of the night though, trying to avoid the uncomfortableness. The next morning, I woke up to my alarm, and I saw Bob was still laying in his bed, likely pretending to be sleeping still. I went through my bag to get my books and such, and I had this feeling in my gut that something was moved in my bag, like it was gone through. I looked up at Bob again, and he was still allegedly sleeping. I decided to take a couple of my more valuable things and throw them in my backpack that I took to class. In class, I emailed the housing department and then submitted a room change request online, stating my roommate made me uncomfortable. After class that day, I returned to my dorm and was confused to notice the door was being held open with a door stopper. I noticed Bob had a big duffel bag on his bed now. I guessed he was unpacking. I laid in my bed on my laptop and eventually Bob came in. He greeted me and went to his bed, where he took his duffel bag and put it under the bed, and he literally just looked at me with this empty expression. I pretended to not really notice, but his weirdness was really bothering me. I finally looked back at him with not a friendly expression, and he gave me a slight nod. Then he climbed into his bed and just laid there on his phone. Eventually, I went out to the dining hall for dinner. When I came back, Bob was still there. I didn't know what his deal was, if he'd ever leave the dorm or what. I asked him if he had class that day. He said yes, but just one. That night, after turning the lights off, I noticed Bob leaning on the wall in his bed, facing me on his phone. I constantly felt like he was looking at me. I was anxious to get a response from the housing department, so I checked my email and saw they responded, but it wasn't the response I was hoping for. The lady who emailed me back expressed confusion in my request, stating my replacement roommate had not yet been assigned and that there should be no one else in the room with me. I looked at Bob, who looked back at me. I was about to ask him if he had his key to the room on him. I didn't ask that though. I put my laptop and other belongings in my backpack and duffel bag, as he just watched. He didn't say anything, and I think he knew that I knew. I left the room without saying anything, went to a safe place and called campus police to report him. By the time they arrived to the dorms, Bob, or whatever his real name was gone, along with his little bit of stuff. I found out that night that he stole some clothes from me, my iPhone charger, and some of the food I stored in my closet. As for what he was doing watching me sleep, I could only imagine he was making sure I was asleep before going through my stuff. I had a completely random, possibly homeless person in my room for basically an entire 24 hours. My real roommate moved in 2 days later. What I'm about to tell you is something that has no explanation. It's the strangest thing that has ever happened to me or anyone I personally know. I work late hours at a dive bar about 30 minutes from my house. It's not really by choice, it's just how things are when you live out in a more rural area. There are not a ton of jobs close to home, so you take what you can get. The bar itself isn't anything special, but it's steady work and most nights are pretty uneventful. The night this all happened was no different. My shift had gone by without much happening, and after closing everything up, I got in my car and started the drive home. Most of the way back is nothing but a series of winding back roads. Hardly any traffic, barely any lights, barely any cars, barely anything, honestly. Just long stretches of curves cutting through woods and farmland. It's usually a pretty quiet drive, and honestly, I've always kind of liked it for that reason. Like a built-in detox where I have time to zone out or think about characters I met at the bar and interesting conversations I may have had with them. Not long into the drive, I remember thinking to myself how unusually foggy it was. I've driven those roads more times than I can count, but that night, visibility was worse than I'd seen in a while. I actually had to ease off the gas and take it slower because I could barely see more than a few car lengths ahead. Even flipping on my brights didn't help. It just made the fog glow and reflect back at me, almost like I was driving into a wall of white. It started pissing me off because I knew it would only add time to my trip, and I was exhausted. I was about halfway home when I noticed it. Through the fog, maybe a little off to the right side of the road, there was this faint yellow blinking light. At first, I figured it was just some kind of roadside marker or maybe a reflector, but as I kept driving, it didn't really get any closer or farther away. It just stayed there, blinking at a steady rhythm, like it was moving right along with me, keeping pace from somewhere deeper in the fog. The whole thing felt a little off. I couldn't tell how far away it actually was. It was like the fog was playing tricks on my depth perception. After about another minute of driving with that blinking light hovering in the exact same place, I started getting this weird feeling in my stomach. I couldn't even explain it to you. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. I decided to slow down a bit, thinking maybe if I let off the gas, the light would keep going and I'd get a better sense of what it actually was, or it would just continue onward and disappear entirely, and I wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. But as I eased down to almost a crawl, the light didn't change at all. It kept blinking at the same steady rhythm, still holding that same distance off to the side, like whatever it was that somehow matched my speed perfectly. That's when I really started to get spooked. I finally came to a full stop just to see if it would do the same, and sure enough, it stayed right there, blinking in the exact same spot with the same rhythm. I sat there for a second, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at and debating whether I should just turn around or keep going. That's when it changed. The blinking didn't stop, but the light itself started getting brighter, like a small flame catching a sudden gust of wind and flaring up. It wasn't flashing faster. It was burning stronger with each pulse, like whatever it was had suddenly gotten more active. That was enough for me. I wasn't about to sit there and wait for whatever that was to get any closer or weirder. I reached down to shift into reverse so I could back up and turn around, but I realized the engine wasn't running. I swear to God, it was dead silent. I had no idea how that was even possible. The only way to kill the engine would have been touching the key, but I distinctly remember never doing that. Why the hell would I do that? At that point, my hands were shaking, and my hands never shake. I pour drinks all day, my hands can't shake. As I was desperately trying to start the car, I couldn't help but think that this thing outside my car had something to do with my engine,
which of course wouldn't start. I tried the ignition again and again. The engine was completely dead. Meanwhile, that blinking yellow light kept burning brighter and brighter and brighter, almost like it was feeding off something. My pulse was racing at that point. I had no idea what the hell was going on, and there was no one around for miles. Not knowing what else to do, I reached for my phone, figuring maybe I could at least get some video of it or call for help. But as soon as I tapped the screen, nothing happened. Completely black, my phone had died. I knew for a fact I still had at least 20%. I had literally checked it back at the bar before I closed up, but now it was as dead as the engine. Before I could do anything else, the light suddenly flared to a blinding brightness, like an exploding star. I physically couldn't keep my eyes open. That's how bright it was. I threw my arms up in front of me and kept my eyes shut for 10 seconds at least, feeling the blaze of what was now a gigantic light bulb. And then, just like that, it was gone, like it had never been there in the first place. The fog was still thick, but there was nothing out there anymore. My heart was still pounding, but I instinctively reached for the ignition one more time, and this time, the engine turned over like normal. I didn't waste another second. I drove the rest of the way home with my eyes glued to the road, as if looking away for even a second would bring that awful light back, but nothing else happened that night. Nothing ever happened again, actually. I've told this story to just about everyone I know, my family, friends, even a couple regulars at the bar, but no one's had an explanation that sits right with me. And trust me, I've heard every theory you could think of. This happened a couple years back. I'm a long-haul truck driver. I've been doing this for years now, so I've gotten pretty used to the long stretches of nothing. This particular night, I was on my second-to-last delivery of a cross-state loop, just trying to knock it out so I could get home. The route had me cutting through one of those desert highways that barely get any traffic at night. No towns for miles, no gas stations, barely even any lights. Just a 2-lane road slicing through open desert under a sky full of stars. It's the kind of drive where you start to feel like you're the only person left on the planet. I was about an hour out from my next drop-off when I first noticed it. I glanced into one of my side mirrors and was kind of surprised to notice a dark SUV back there, trailing me. It wasn't riding my bumper or anything aggressive like that. It was actually keeping a pretty wide distance, but it was definitely following. No matter how fast or slow I went, it adjusted to match. For nearly 40 miles, it just hovered there in my mirrors. Always visible, always keeping that same strange gap. It never tried to speed up or pass, just sat back there like it was waiting for something. At first, I thought it was a driver who was afraid to pass me. Maybe they thought it was illegal or dangerous, but I cast that theory aside after driving through several passing zones. I guess it was possible they didn't know what a passing zone was, but I figured that was pretty implausible. As much as I was dying to know what was going on, I had a job to do. I couldn't afford to devote the whole night to figuring out what the guy behind me's problem was, so I tried to ignore him. As much as I tried, though, I couldn't help but glance at his car every so often. It was really starting to make me tick, which is something I rarely ever do. Around 2 a.m., I decided to pull off at a small roadside rest area. It wasn't a full truck stop or anything like that, just a dirt lot with a few faded parking spaces and a little shed with a couple of vending machines. There were also no external lights in the whole lot except for one dim bulb flickering above the vending machines. I figured I'd stretch my legs for a minute, grab a soda, and more importantly, let whoever was behind me pass. But when I glanced back before shutting off the engine, I saw that SUV pull in too, parking way off in the far corner of the lot. At that point, whatever confusion or discomfort I was feeling became pure rage. Whoever was driving that SUV was about to get a piece of my mind. I aggressively stepped down from the cab and started making my way over to the car, not even trying to disguise my frustration. But as I was stomping my way over there, whoever was inside must have realized that I was about to confront them, because before I could even get close, the SUV's engine suddenly flared to life and they peeled out of the spot like they were running from the cops, kicking up a huge cloud of dust and gravel. As they sped past me, I tried to catch a glimpse of the jagoff who was behind the wheel, but the windows were tinted and I couldn't make anything out. I watched as the car got back on the highway, tires still screeching. Within seconds, it was gone. just a flicker of red taillights that quickly receded into nothingness. Part of me was relieved. I wouldn't have to deal with that nuisance anymore, and I could finally go about my night in peace. But another part of me was deeply unsettled. I had basically confirmed to myself that whoever was driving that car had been following me for some unknown reason. And what's worse, they clearly didn't want me approaching their vehicle, so their intentions must have been hostile. As I was returning from the vending machines, which coincidentally were completely unstocked, so that had been a huge waste of time, I only then realized how tired the whole encounter made me. My energy was zapped, and the last thing I wanted to do was get back on the road. I figured I'd earned at least a short break after all that, just a quick nap, an hour or two to recharge before finishing the route in the morning. I did a quick walk around the rig. I made sure the cargo doors were still locked and everything was secured tight, then climbed back into the cab. I reclined my seat, cracked the window slightly to let some air in, and settled in for a bit of rest. The lot was dead quiet by that point, and for the first time all night, I actually started to relax. My logic was that even if that person did mean me harm, there's no way they'd turn their vehicle around just to continue harassing me. Even if they did want to come back, finding the lot again would be next to impossible. They'd have to search blindly in the middle of a pitch-black desert. The combination of my exhaustion and newfound comfort made falling asleep really easy. If I had to guess, I'd say I fell asleep that night in a matter of minutes. I should probably mention that I'm a really light sleeper. Like, really light. You kind of have to be in this line of work. Sleeping in sketchy roadside places so often builds a third eye, so to speak. If someone's messing with your rig while you're asleep, your entire livelihood could be at risk, not to mention your life. So yeah, the ability to wake up to even faint sounds could be the difference between job and no job, life and death. Maybe an hour after falling asleep, you guessed it, I was woken up by the faintest little noise, a light crunching sound like footsteps pressing into the loose gravel. Even though I was still groggy, I had enough sense to keep quiet. I cracked the corner of one of my window blinds to take a look outside, and sure enough, there were two figures standing near the rear wheels of my trailer. They were crouched down low, inspecting the lower latch mechanisms like they were trying to figure out how to open them without making too much noise. They were keeping pretty quiet, but I noticed one of them had a small flashlight, using it to signal back and forth to the other. I couldn't make out any faces, but it was clear as day what they were doing. I didn't have any weapon on me. I usually don't, but if it came down to it, I was fully prepared to defend my rig and load. That's my life. As I watched, one of the guys reached into a small bag and pulled out what looked like a pair of bolt cutters. That was it. Without even thinking, I slammed my palm down on the horn, sending the truck's air horn blaring. Their reaction was instant. Both men jumped like they'd been hit with a lightning bolt, and they scrambled back towards the roadside brush. Not even 10 seconds later, I saw headlights appear out of nowhere. It was that same SUV from earlier, this time roaring back into view with its lights still off, before whipping around and disappearing into the night again. I never even had time to step out of my cab before the whole thing was over. After things calmed down a bit, I called the police. Honestly, I was mostly just calling to report the incident and get it on record, but they insisted I stay put until a unit could get there to check things out. It took a while, but eventually 2 officers showed up and helped me inspect the truck. Sure enough, there were fresh pry marks along one of the lower lock arms on the back of my trailer, right where those guys had been messing around. Fortunately, they hadn't gotten it open. The officers told me they'd seen this kind of thing before. Cargo thieves. Apparently it's a lot more common along that corridor than most people realize. They figured the SUV had been following me for a while, waiting for the right time to strike. This remains the most unsettling thing that has ever happened to me. There's nothing better than a night drive, especially in the summer. Picture this. The warm summer breeze flowing through the open windows of a speeding car cutting through empty stretches of endless highway. Well, that's what it's like around my neck of the woods anyway. There aren't a lot of cars out on the highway at night, no cops either, so I essentially have free rein to drive how I please. And trust me, I take full advantage of that. My dad's BMW M3 definitely assists in that regard too. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a reckless driver or someone who operates a car at criminal speeds. but I do enjoy experiencing the full capabilities of German engineering from time to time. This night was one of those times. I was full-on joyriding, cruising along the highway without a care in the world, stereo turned off and passenger seat empty. My ears were focused not on music, but on two other things, the beautiful sounds of my car and the whip of the air around my face. Driving like this is one of the only things that makes me feel truly free. I'm not sure what came over me, but at one point I had this insatiable urge to pull off the highway and cut up some back roads where I could really appreciate the car's handling. It's like when you get a really strong urge to do something and you don't really know why, but you do know that you won't be able to sleep at night if you don't satisfy it. That's exactly what it was like. So I did exactly that. I pulled off at the next exit and started cutting through a network of back roads, weaving through whatever neighborhood I had landed in. The roads were narrow and filled with tight bends, exactly the kind of driving I was looking for. I let the car open up a bit, taking the turns with just enough speed to feel the tires grip and release. The streets were completely deserted. It was just me, the car, and the road. That is, until I spotted a flicker of light in the road up ahead and slammed on the brakes just in time to barely avoid smashing into it. Once I came to a stop, I finally got a clear look at what I had almost hit. It was a shopping cart, just sitting there in the middle of the road like someone had wheeled it out and left it. The way my headlights bounced off the metal bars must have been what caught my eye and made it look a lot more sudden and dramatic than it really was. Still, it completely threw me off. I mean, it's not exactly normal to find a random shopping cart sitting dead center in the middle of a back road at close to midnight. Against my better judgment, I put the car in park, turned on my hazards, and stepped out to take a closer look. I probably should have just kept driving, but my curiosity got the better of me. The whole thing just felt so random and out of place that I had this weird need to make sense of it. The night air hit me right away, warm but a little buggy, and the only sound was my cooling engine making the classic BMW ticking sound. I walked up to the cart, unsure of what I'd find inside. Groceries maybe? No, that was ridiculous. I internally scolded myself for letting such a dumb thought even enter my brain. I peered inside the cart and realized it was completely empty, just an ordinary metal shopping cart sitting in the middle of the road. I stood there for a few seconds, but when it became clear there was nothing unusual about the cart itself, I turned to head back toward my car. That's when I saw out of the corner of my eye, two dark figures suddenly broke out from the farmland beside the road. They were sprinting full speed, coming straight toward me. It took my brain a second to even process what I was seeing, but in that moment, it was life or death. My options were either act or die. I bolted back to my car and basically punched the start button. The car came to life as those figures made it to my car window. One of them stopped a few feet from my car, but the other one sprinted directly into my passenger side door, coming to a halt with a deafening thump. He didn't even flinch. It was as if my car were invisible. That's how fast he had been running. He didn't even brace himself for the impact. The two of us locked eyes, and all the confidence I just had was instantly gone. I was frozen. He stared at me with two beady, bloodshot eyes. His clothes were torn, like he'd been running through thick brush or barbed wire, and his hair was messy and wet. His face was smeared with something dark, dirt or blood or maybe both. He had this unsettling, vacant expression on his face that wasn't exactly a scowl, but wasn't exactly a smile either. I've never been more terrified in my entire life. It was bad. There was blood spurting from somewhere on his body, but he didn't seem to care or even notice. He must have realized I wasn't going anywhere, because he started fumbling with the door handle, trying to pry the door open. That's what did it for me. I snapped back to reality, maneuvered the car around the shopping cart, and sped out of there. I was beyond conflicted the whole drive home. Not only was I still shaken up and scared, but part of me also felt like that person needed help for his wounds and wasn't going to get it. I debated going back to see if he needed help, but ultimately decided against it. Instead, I reported the incident to the police while still driving, and they said they'd send someone over to the spot I described to check it out. When I finally made it back home, I parked in the driveway and got out to inspect the car. I needed to know how bad the damage was. That's when I noticed there was blood spattered across the entire passenger side door, way more than I had expected. It was streaked along the side mirror, smeared across the handle, even dotting part of the rear quarter panel. There was also a slight dent near the center of the door, just barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. The amount of blood, though, that's what really got to me. It was far more than I would have thought from that brief impact. It was an inhuman amount of blood. The next morning, my dad took one look at the car and completely lost it. He didn't even give me a chance to explain before he started going off, yelling about how irresponsible I was, how I should have never taken the car out that late, and how much it was going to cost to fix the paint and the dent. I kept trying to tell him that it wasn't my fault, that something happened out there that I couldn't have possibly predicted, but he wasn't having it. To him, all he saw was his car covered in blood with a dented door, and that was enough. I may have hit a deer for all he cared. He eventually did come around to what had happened, and he was actually pretty sympathetic, but not until after I got the car cleaned up. And let's just say that that was one of the last times he let me go joyriding after dark. I'm pretty sure I can explain everything that happened. Those people, probably homeless, had tried to lure some unsuspecting soul out of their car with a shopping cart. I had been that unsuspecting soul that night. They just hadn't been fast or stealthy enough to get the jump on me before I could get out of there. I never heard back from the police, but I wasn't really expecting to. Part of me feels like I shouldn't care, but I really hate thinking an impact with my car might have ended someone's life that night.